There is a door beneath Rome no one is allowed to open. Not journalists, not scholars, not even most clergy. Behind it lie shelves that stretch for miles, stacked with documents written in the hand of emperors, heretics, and popes who lived centuries apart. And yet, their secrets sit side by side. The Vatican calls it an archive, but the world knows it by a different name: the Secret Archives. Some say they protect truth, others say they hide it. So ask yourself, if there's nothing to fear in the light, why bury so much in the dark? Now let the urgency slow. Imagine the echo of footsteps on polished marble, a shaft of golden light cutting across a cold floor. Candles flicker against stone, and just ahead, the hush of something vast and ancient held shut by silence. You're no longer watching the mystery. You've stepped inside it. For over 4 centuries, the Vatican Secret Archives have remained one of the most heavily guarded collections on Earth. Nestled beneath the Apostolic Palace, their passages run deeper than most cathedrals rise. Over 35,000 volumes, 53 miles of shelving. And yet only a tiny fraction has ever seen daylight. Inside are whispers of suppressed gospels, forbidden rituals, coded correspondences, and entire bloodlines that the Church may have wished the world would forget. And the few who have glimpsed its contents, they speak in half-truths and warnings like those who've looked too long at something meant to stay hidden. You're about to follow their footsteps, slowly, quietly, one vault at a time. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. You stand at the edge of the 17th century, in a time when the Renaissance had already painted its masterpieces, and the Enlightenment was beginning to knock faintly at the door. It is the year 1612. Rome is bustling with artists, astronomers, merchants, and men of God, each competing for a place in a world that is shifting under their feet. But behind the walls of the Vatican, something far quieter is unfolding. A decree, a signature, a door quietly sealed, and with it, the most powerful religious institution on earth shuts its history away from the very flock it claims to shepherd. Pope Paul V was not known for subtlety. He expanded the Basilica of St. Peter. He commissioned fountains, monuments, and royal chapels. Yet curiously, the most enduring legacy of his papacy was not something he built for all to see, but something he locked away. By his order, the Archivum Secretum Vaticanum, the Vatican's secret archive, was formally closed to outsiders. What had once been available, at least in part, to select theologians or trusted advisors, was now fully sequestered. No scholar, no king, no curious priest would enter unless the Church allowed it, which, as it turned out, they almost never did. This wasn't a random act of administrative housekeeping. The Church had always kept records, from early martyrdoms to inquisitions, from imperial letters to inventories of relics. But what Paul V enacted was a deliberate change of access. In an era when printing presses were churning out new ideas like wildfire, when Galileo's telescope was revealing things that didn't match Genesis, and when Protestant reformers were challenging Rome's every word, the Church responded not with open dialogue, but with silence. It built walls of parchment and protocols. And no, the irony is not lost, that the word secretum in Latin doesn't mean secret in the modern sense, but rather private. A technicality, sure, but a useful one. After all, secrecy cloaked in bureaucracy is still secrecy. Historians often debate whether Paul's decision was driven by fear or foresight. On the one hand, he may have believed that consolidating church records would prevent their misuse by enemies, theological or political. On the other hand, perhaps he knew too well the kind of truths those shelves contained. Uncomfortable truths. documents from popes who contradicted one another, letters from kings that revealed backroom deals, early Christian writings that did not align with later dogma, and maybe texts that spoke of visions, miracles, and bloodlines that had been scrubbed from official canon. One letter written during Paul's time hints at internal panic. A cardinal refers obliquely to documents of such nature that their misreading could fracture faith. Not destroy the church, but fracture faith. That word choice is telling. It suggests that what lies within the archive is not necessarily false, but simply destabilizing, like a mirror held too close, or a family diary that reveals you're not the first to stumble. Of course, some see Paul's actions as perfectly reasonable. Every state has its classified files. Why not the Vatican? After all, it functions as both church and sovereign micronation. And yet what makes the secret archive different is its span. Its contents are not just national secrets. They are theological time bombs wrapped in Latin ink. Because when your claim is to divine authority, when you trace your power to apostolic succession and unbroken tradition, then the past isn't just a reference. It's the foundation. And any crack in it could bring the entire edifice into question. For the next 250 years, the archive remained almost entirely shut. Not even the most eminent historians could gain access. Rumors began to grow in the silence. Some claimed it contained lost books of the Bible. Others whispered of Templar confessions, ancient maps, or heretical doctrines signed by saints. By the 19th century, poets and skeptics alike were painting the Vatican as the ultimate hoarder of truth, not just a guardian of Scripture, but a gatekeeper of history itself. It wasn't until 1881 that limited access was finally granted by Pope Leo III, and even then only to carefully selected scholars under tight restrictions. Visitors were and still are monitored. Documents must be requested with precise information, no wandering among shelves, no idle curiosity. It's like asking someone to find a grain of salt in a sealed cathedral, but only if you can already describe that grain's exact shape, color, and shelf number. You might wonder if the archive is so heavily restricted, how we even know what's in it. That's the strange part. We don't, not entirely. What has been cataloged represents a fraction, and even that fraction contains enough buried stories to fill libraries. For instance, the letter from Henry VIII requesting annulment from Catherine of Aragon, it's there. So is the 1308 Chinon parchment, in which the Pope quietly absolved the Templars, even as they were being tortured and burned across Europe. Which brings us to a lingering question: why close the door in 1612 and why open it ever so slightly in 1881? One interpretation is simple: the Church realized the pressure was mounting. In the age of newspapers and revolutions, to keep everything sealed was to appear guilty. Another view is more strategic. A slow release of benign or flattering documents could rebuild trust, while the more incendiary scrolls remained hidden. And here's a curious footnote. The Vatican has repeatedly stated that its archive is not sinister, that it contains no secrets, only history. But when they digitized just a sliver of it, in recent years, one archivist slipped in an odd comment during a press interview: "There are documents we know not to request." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The doors may have been sealed over 4 centuries ago, but their shadow stretches into the present. And as we move deeper into these labyrinthine halls, what matters most is not just what was hidden, but who decided it should be. The first thing you notice is how little it resembles a place of reading. There are no stained glass windows letting in divine light, no hushed scholars paging through tomes by candlelight. The Vatican Secret Archive is not the romantic sanctuary of dusty manuscripts you might expect. It is cold. It is industrial. It is layered with stone, steel, and silence. This is not a library. It is a vault. And if it feels more like a fortress than a sanctuary, that's entirely by design. To call it underground is only partially accurate. Much of the archive sits beneath the Vatican complex, but parts stretch laterally beneath the gardens and neighboring structures, a nerve system of sealed chambers, temperature controls, fireproof vaults, and motion-triggered security systems. It was designed to outlive wars, floods, even firebombings. Because when you claim to guard the memory of God's church on earth, you don't store that memory in a filing cabinet. Most of what you'll hear about its dimensions comes from numbers that sound exaggerated until you realize they're not. Over 50 miles of shelving, over 35,000 volumes. And that's just what's been cataloged. Some say the full length is even greater, with undisclosed subchambers holding artifacts rather than texts. But that part is speculation. What isn't speculative is how many eyes you'll have watching you if you try to enter. Access requires more than credentials. You must be a qualified scholar, submit a specific research request, and receive clearance from Vatican officials. You cannot simply stroll through the stacks. There is no wandering. You are guided, observed, and limited. And what you're handed may already be pre-selected, curated, or redacted. One historian likened the process to studying a cathedral by being allowed to peek through a keyhole at its floor tiles. The climate inside is regulated to preserve parchment, vellum, and ink. The lighting is minimal, the corridors narrow. Guards patrol the perimeter, not the kind in cassocks, but in suits, earpieces, and discreet boots. Cameras are hidden in the corners, silent but omnipresent. They are not watching for fire. They are watching for curiosity. You might expect these measures during a war or at a military installation, but this level of protection for documents, old, fragile, dusty documents, raises a question. What precisely is so dangerous about these papers? The answer might lie in what's been whispered by those who gained limited entry. One French academic described finding an entire shelf of correspondences between papal envoys and unnamed courts of sorcery in 15th century France, without explanation or footnotes. A Spanish scholar claimed to have requested a manuscript on early Marian visions only to be quietly denied, with no record that the document ever existed. Even more unsettling is the quiet rumor that not all shelves are physically accessible, that some are metaphorically buried behind administrative refusal, or perhaps literally behind false walls. Historically, the Church has always understood the power of symbols, but in the archive, it understands something deeper, the power of absence. A forbidden document is more powerful than a published one. A page torn from history doesn't just disappear, it echoes. And the vault's most effective weapon is this very silence. Because when something cannot be disproven, it begins to ferment into myth. Take the case of the so-called papal chronovault, a name invented by outsiders, not the Vatican, which refers to a theorized chamber containing prophetic texts or ancient timelines, inconsistent with the Church's accepted chronology. No one credible has seen it. But the fact that access to certain historical periods is inexplicably more difficult to obtain has kept the theory alive. In particular, requests for records from the early 4th century, the period between Constantine's conversion and the Council of Nicaea, are often denied or under review, as if those years are somehow radioactive. Of course, the official explanation is always the same: preservation, privacy, proper vetting. And to be fair, some of this is true. The archive does contain sensitive diplomatic correspondences, confessional material, and legal texts that touch on current geopolitics. But that only explains a sliver. The level of defense doesn't just suggest sensitive content, it suggests danger. This idea becomes clearer when you compare it to other major archives around the world. the British Library, the National Archives in the US. Even Russia's state libraries all maintain restricted zones, but none cloak their past in quite the same velvet of selective amnesia. The Vatican's approach is uniquely paradoxical. It acknowledges that the past is holy, and then wraps that holiness in barbed wire. The sense of selective memory is perhaps most evident in how few documents from the archive have been made available digitally. In an age where even ancient Babylonian tablets have been scanned and shared online, the Vatican has released only a few curated pages, mostly diplomatic letters, ecclesiastical registers, or known papal bulls. Nothing controversial, nothing game-changing. It's as if a museum allowed visitors to see only the empty pedestals and told them the statues were not relevant right now. Curiously, Pope Francis recently authorized the opening of documents from the pontificate of Pius X, a move praised by some historians, especially those examining the Church's role during World War II. But even this gesture came with limits. Scholars noted that some boxes were inexplicably missing, and others contained redacted pages. So the archive is still very much a fortress, just with slightly cleaner windows. In the 1970s, an Italian priest working as an archivist was asked why the Vatican chose secrecy over openness. He paused, smiled, and said, "Because the devil quotes scripture." But we have the footnotes. The quote was meant as a joke. Probably. But it reveals something quietly profound. The archive is not just about protecting history from the world. It's about protecting the Church from history. And that's the fortress's true purpose. Not to store knowledge, but to control it. Because when your power rests on a single unbroken story, divine, unblemished, sacred, then even one footnote misaligned could begin to tear at the seams. Which means this archive isn't just defensive architecture, it's narrative armor, and it's built thicker than stone. There's something uniquely ironic about an institution that defines itself by a sacred text, and yet has spent centuries telling you which books you're not allowed to read. For much of its history, the Catholic Church didn't just curate Scripture, it quarantined it. And nowhere is that more evident than in the pages of a now defunct, but once deadly list, the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Index of Forbidden Books. You don't find it on most modern reading lists, but for over 400 years, the index dictated what was safe for Catholic eyes. Banned titles ranged from the predictably scandalous to the surprisingly tame. Copernicus forbidden, Galileo, of course, but also Descartes, Montaigne, Pascal, and even some Bible translations. At one point, the Church forbade the very act of reading the Scriptures in your native tongue without permission. God's Word apparently required proper supervision. The Index was first published in 1559 under Pope Paul XIV, yes, another Paul, and underwent multiple revisions until it was formally abolished in 1966. But the Vatican didn't just throw it away. Copies of every edition still exist, and more importantly, many of the banned books themselves are believed to have been preserved. Not in some dusty basement pile, but inside the secret archives. It raises a delicate question: why save what you've condemned? If these works were so dangerous to the faithful, wouldn't destruction be the more consistent policy? Burning has certainly been on the table before, ask Giordano Bruno. And yet many of the very texts denounced by the Index seem to have been quietly filed away, not incinerated. Take the case of De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium, Copernicus's landmark treatise on heliocentrism. It was banned, then allowed, then banned again. Yet at least 2 original copies are believed to be in the Vatican's possession. The Jesuit scholar Athanasius Kircher's controversial works, blending alchemy, linguistics, and theology, were denounced and buried. But fragments resurface occasionally, always with a Vatican stamp on the corner. And then there's Pico della Mirandola, whose 900 theses were declared heretical and suppressed, yet whose ideas filtered quietly through later Vatican writings, repurposed in less alarming robes. Some historians believe the archive functions not as a vault of destruction, but as a kind of theological quarantine. Dangerous texts are not destroyed, but neutralized, removed from public access, stored under controlled conditions, and revisited only when doctrine is mature enough to reinterpret or absorb them. Others are more cynical. They argue that the Vatican holds onto these writings not for study or preservation, but for control. If you hold the only surviving copies of the most controversial books in Western history, you get to decide which truths survive and which remain rumors. Even stranger are the whispers of books whose existence the index never acknowledged, texts that never made it to the official list, because to name them would have drawn too much attention. One recurring name is the Gospel of Judas, a text rediscovered in the 1970s and made public decades later, which portrays Judas not as a traitor, but as the one disciple who truly understood Jesus. When it was revealed, some scholars noted that references to the text appeared in internal Vatican correspondence as early as the 1930s. So if the Church already had a copy, why the long delay in admitting it? That pattern repeats. The Gospel of Mary, which suggests that Mary Magdalene was a central interpreter of Jesus' teachings, was once thought to survive only in fragmented Coptic manuscripts. Yet a German researcher reviewing notes from the 1920s found casual references to it in the margins of a Vatican catalog, as if it had already been red-indexed and then quietly shelved. Then there's the Book of Enoch, a text revered in some early Christian communities, referenced in the New Testament itself, but excluded from canon. Though largely forgotten in the West, it was preserved in Ethiopian Christianity. Yet scholars tracing ancient manuscript shipments have long suspected that multiple Greek and Latin copies, now lost to the world, were absorbed into the secret archives centuries ago. The strangest case might be the elusive Gospel of the 12, a text rumored among apocryphal circles, which claims to contain teachings of Jesus, dictated to all 12 disciples simultaneously. Most mainstream historians consider it myth, but the rumor won't die. A letter from 1789 held in a private French collection mentions a gospel unacknowledged by Rome, locked in the red folders of the Secretum. Of course, the Vatican denies any knowledge of these texts, but then again it would. The open question that continues to divide scholars is whether the Church's archival policy was driven by fear, piety, or something more strategic. Did it suppress these writings to protect orthodoxy, to maintain narrative control, or because they revealed a version of history in which apostolic truth was far messier than the Catechism suggests? One Italian researcher once joked that the Church treated books the way it treated witches: silence them, bury them, then eventually canonize them under a new name. It's a dark joke, but it contains a quiet truth. The index may have been retired in 1966, but its ghost lingers in the stacks of the Vatican's deepest halls. There's one last twist. A recently declassified memo from 1948 released not by the Church, but by an American intelligence agency refers obliquely to a high-priority recovery of texts from Vatican custody deemed of extreme theological volatility. The memo was heavily redacted. The destination of those texts remains unknown, but it raises an uncomfortable possibility. Some of the most forbidden books may no longer be in the archive at all. They may have vanished, or been moved somewhere even darker. You lean in now, deeper into the maze of vaults, and the smell of vellum and dust begins to fade into something stranger, older. You're no longer looking at the official story of Christianity. You're tracing the ghosts of the stories that were silenced. Because beyond the canonical four, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, lies a buried library of Gospels that once vied for the soul of early Christianity. And the greatest rumor whispered among archivists and scholars alike is that some of the most complete versions of these Gospels aren't in desert caves or remote monasteries. They're beneath Rome, in the vaults. The Gnostic texts are usually the first suspects. Found in Nag Hammadi in 1945, they rocked the theological world with their strange cosmology's inverted hierarchies and a Christ that seemed more metaphysical than sacrificial. Among them, the Gospel of Thomas reads like a riddle book of divine puzzles, while the Gospel of Philip hints at sacraments involving the body and perhaps the flesh in ways the institutional church found unsettling. Then there's the Gospel of Truth, a poetic meditation so abstract it reads like a spiritual labyrinth. But the copies we know are fragmentary, fragile, and in Coptic. What if the complete versions in Greek or even Latin exist in Rome? One story that resurfaces like a half-remembered dream involves Cardinal Eugène Tisserand, archivist of the Vatican Library in the 1940s. A polyglot and scholar of Eastern texts, he was rumored to have overseen a sealed translation project involving non-canonical writings recovered from the East. Nothing ever surfaced publicly, but a former assistant speaking decades later described being tasked with preparing reference cards for a document titled Logia Jesu Traditio Secreta, Sayings of Jesus, the Secret Tradition. No such document has ever been published or referenced in academic circles. But the name matches a lost category of sayings gospels where Jesus speaks but never dies. Then there's the case of the Gospel of the Hebrews. Mentioned by early church fathers like Jerome and Origen, it was apparently revered by certain Jewish Christian sects in the 1st and 2nd centuries. The text has long been lost, except for a few preserved quotations. Yet a 1911 acquisition register from a Jesuit seminary lists a Hebraic manuscript of apostolic origin, non-canonical, under lock. Where did that manuscript go? No one knows. The seminary was later absorbed into the Vatican's broader library system, and the trail ends there except for a notation in a later catalog now kept at the Secretum. It's not just what the Gospels say, it's who speaks in them. Mary Magdalene appears again and again, not as the tearful footnote to resurrection, but as a central teacher. In the Gospel of Mary, she comforts grieving disciples, interprets visions, and dares to challenge Peter. And Peter in turn doubts her not for lack of holiness, but for being a woman. That tension, that challenge to apostolic hierarchy is perhaps why the Gospel vanished from the mainstream for so long. But did it vanish entirely? A 1956 inventory list from the Archivum Secretum, declassified in part in the 1990s, included a listing labeled Cod. MM 244 Dialogues inter Mariam et Petrum. Scholars dismissed it at the time. Surely it was a known apocryphal debate. But some now wonder if it was something more. A complete Greek version of the Magdalene Gospel, a companion dialogue, or a parallel text entirely, no one has been able to confirm. The entry disappeared from later inventories, and still deeper theories linger. One alleges the existence of a gospel according to Joseph of Arimathea, chronicling not just the burial of Christ, but visions that followed, visions that contradicted the bodily resurrection. Another speculates about a Gospel of the 12, not the one previously rumored in France, but a separate text, catalogued by title in an obscure 17th century Polish cardinal's private notes. In both cases, no manuscripts have been found. But again, the archive doesn't reveal. It merely denies. A particularly controversial theory suggests that during the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, a time of intense doctrinal consolidation, church agents collected and sequestered heterodox Gospels en masse. One document known as the Libellus Contra Apocrypha allegedly lists 27 fragments and codices currently under ecclesial silence. The Vatican has never confirmed the existence of this inventory, but a Jesuit historian named Father Enrico Magnani once claimed to have seen it in microfilm format during the 1960s. His written accounts were vague. His access was later revoked. The open question, and it still hangs like a whisper behind the shelves, is whether the Church feared these texts because they were false, or because they were plausible. Because if even one gospel tells of a Christ who didn't die, or a disciple who was never a man, or a teaching that contradicts damnation entirely, then the entire edifice of tradition begins to wobble. Curiously, some of these themes appear elsewhere in late medieval mystical writings, in the ecstatic visions of Hildegard, or in the apocalyptic drawings of Joachim of Fiore. But these echoes often end in censure. The Church has a way of absorbing what it can and burying what it can't. Which leads to one last peculiar incident. In 2007, a researcher reviewing digitized indexes of medieval manuscripts noted a blank entry labeled Ev. Incognitum A, no description, no metadata, just a shelf code and a redacted access note. When he inquired, he received a courteous but firm response. This file is currently unavailable for theological review. Not missing, not restricted, unavailable for theological review. As if truth itself had a waiting period, and so you walk further past rows of parchment and bindings so old they hum with age, and you wonder, how many Gospels did Jesus inspire, and how many were deemed too dangerous for faith? The archive may never answer. But its silence is louder than any sermon. You step into a narrower passage now, where the temperature drops and the air grows dense not with dust, but with something else, the weight of decisions made in ink that once shifted continents. The Vatican Secret Archive isn't just a repository of lost Gospels and heretical texts. It is also the quiet resting place of some of the most delicate and dangerous correspondences ever exchanged, letters between popes and emperors, kings and pontiffs, Caesars and vicars of Christ. In these pages, entire wars begin and end before the first sword is drawn. And sometimes what's not written says even more than what is. The historical fact is simple enough. From at least the 4th century onward, popes and rulers communicated constantly about doctrine-land disputes, excommunications, alliances, betrayals, and occasionally salvation. But these weren't casual notes. They were weapons. A papal letter could legitimize a crown or unmake it. An emperor's parchment could threaten schism or demand obedience. And where do you suppose these letters ended up? Hundreds of them, possibly thousands, are known to be preserved inside the archive. Some are catalogued. Many are not. A few are still sealed. The official explanation is that they are held for diplomatic integrity or historical preservation. But there's a lingering question scholars love to ask: how many of these letters were never meant to be seen again? One of the most famous letters now confirmed to be in the archive is a correspondence between Pope Leo XIII and Attila the Hun. According to church tradition, Leo met Attila face to face and miraculously persuaded him to turn back from invading Rome. The actual contents of that letter, however, remain unseen by the public. What promise, what threat, or what deal was struck that made the scourge of God change course? A spiritual rebuke, or a material offer far too valuable to refuse, fast forward 1,000 years to the reign of Charlemagne. After being crowned Emperor of the Romans by Pope Leo III in 800 AD, he wrote regularly to the Vatican. Some of those letters have been published, others have not. Among the unpublished ones, rumors swirl of a strange request. Charlemagne allegedly asked the Pope to recognize a second line of descent, not from his legitimate wife, but from a concubine of Jewish heritage. Whether true or apocryphal, the implication is deeply sensitive. It would mean that the founder of the Holy Roman Empire wanted a bloodline sanctified that the Church would later bury. And then there are the Crusades. The letters between Urban II and European kings are well documented, but in the archive, there are sealed communications between popes and Muslim rulers, documents that suggest truces, shared enemies, and even theological debates. One particular entry in an 18th-century catalogue refers to Dialogus cum sultano sub sigillo lateranense, a dialogue with a sultan under the Lateran seal. Its contents have never been released. What could possibly be discussed in a papal letter to a sultan that would warrant 400 years of secrecy? More chilling are the documents from the 20th century. Letters between Pope Pius X and Adolf Hitler exist. The Vatican has acknowledged them. But access is limited and redactions are common. Critics argue the correspondence reveals a papacy caught between moral obligation and political survival. Supporters say the Church did all it could to protect the innocent behind the scenes. But the silence speaks volumes, especially when post-war letters between the Vatican and surviving Nazi officials begin to surface, some pleading for mercy, others thanking the Church for aid in discreet relocations. The so-called rat lines used by former SS officers to escape Europe were long dismissed as conspiracy, until evidence began showing up in archived letters. One fragment cited but not released in full allegedly contains a plea from a Croatian cleric to the Vatican for safe passage. The response, also partial, bears the chilling phrase, "For the sake of future reconciliation, steps will be taken quietly." What steps, for whom, and at what cost? Even further back in the time of Henry VIII, letters between the English king and Pope Clement VII are documented, but only partially disclosed. We know about the infamous request for annulment, but what's less known is a cryptic note filed among the same documents referring to records of lineage disputed and now suppressed. Some speculate it relates to Mary Boleyn's children. Others believe it concerns ancient claims of Arthurian descent Henry hoped to validate through the Church. Either way, it was deemed unfit for public eyes. You begin to realize these are not just letters. They are threads in a tapestry so large it could redraw our understanding of power. They reveal how the Vatican was never just a passive spiritual authority, but an active geopolitical player, one that left no fingerprints, but all the leverage. A lesser-known letter barely mentioned in any publication is believed to be a response from Pope Innocent III to a ruler in the East who questioned the divinity of Christ. Not to scold him, but to negotiate. The letter allegedly includes the phrase, "We do not speak of dogma when dialogue serves conversion." If genuine, it would suggest a theological flexibility rarely admitted, a willingness to bend the immovable so long as the Church gained ground. And through it all, one can't help but ask if these are the letters that even partial inventories admit exist. What else is down here? There's a moment of discomfort as you imagine it, a chest of scrolls sealed not with wax, but with red silk bound tightly and tagged with initials no longer recognized. The kind of documents that could collapse myths, undo sainthood, or expose the sacraments as political theater. Letters that no one dares translate. Not because the language is dead, but because the truth isn't. You breathe in the stillness. These were never just letters. They were chess moves. And the Vatican, it seems, has always preferred to play 12 moves ahead. The parchment feels colder here. not because of climate controls, but because the very air hums with the memory of betrayal. These vaults, so heavy with whispers, have long been rumored to hold a complete record of one of history's most sensational disappearances, the systematic destruction of the Knights Templar. Publicly, their downfall is blamed on debt suspicion and the paranoia of kings. But quietly buried under papal seals and coded entries, there is a deeper suggestion that the Vatican always knew more than it let on and chose silence over truth. The historical record tells us that in 1307 King Philip IV of France ordered the mass arrest of the Templars. Accusations included heresy, blasphemy, and indecent rituals, the kind of charges that echo louder when torture is involved. Under pressure, Pope Clement V issued a papal bull sanctioning investigations, though his initial hesitation was notable. What's rarely mentioned is how much of this process was recorded in writing, in confession transcripts, inquisitorial notes, and diplomatic correspondence. Much of it naturally ended up in Rome. For centuries, it was believed that the Templar files were either destroyed or forever sealed. That changed in 2001 when a Vatican archivist named Barbara Fraile stumbled across a parchment in a misfiled volume, the now famous Chinon parchment. It revealed that in 1308, Pope Clement V had privately absolved the Templar leadership of heresy. This one document undermined centuries of church narrative. The Templars, at least according to the Pope himself, had not betrayed the faith. So why then did the Church allow their execution? The Chinon parchment is not the only record. According to archival rumors, the Vatican possesses dozens more documents related to the trial, many of which remain unpublished. A late 19th century catalog entry lists an entire leather-bound volume titled Templi Inquisitio, Regnum Francorum, which may contain interrogation transcripts from Templar strongholds outside of Paris. Another entry references Notae Obscurae Clementis, believed to be marginal notes from Clement V himself, expressing doubts about the legitimacy of the charges. These notes have never been seen. Their title alone, Obscure Remarks, feels like an admission. An obscure but telling detail involves the seal markings. Multiple folders from this era are stamped not with papal crests, but with a strange insignia, a cross flanked by two keys beneath a crescent moon. Scholars disagree on its meaning. Some suggest it was the private mark of an unnamed notary. Others believe it was used to designate records requiring permanent secrecy. But the moon, a symbol not commonly associated with Roman Catholic iconography, raises eyebrows. One historian speculated it was borrowed from Templar heraldry itself, signaling that these files were not merely administrative, but sacred to the order. Then there are the gaps. The official records of the Council of Vienne in 1312, where the Templar order was formally dissolved, reference testimony under the authority of the Holy Father. Yet no copies of that testimony survive in the public record. A 17th century librarian named Costanzo Moneta once mentioned seeing volumes bound in black leather concerning the trial of the soldiers of the temple, stored in what he called the Lower Romanum. This sub-vault, possibly beneath the standard archive, is no longer mentioned in modern maps. An open question remains: why would the Vatican hide absolution documents for 700 years? One answer is political. By the time the parchment was written, the Templars had already been condemned in the court of public opinion. To release the truth then would have exposed the Pope's impotence and risked a schism. But a darker interpretation persists. Some believe the absolution was known all along, not hidden out of shame, but preserved in case of future necessity. A kind of truth held in escrow. There's a curious callback to earlier lore. The Templars were not just warriors, but also record keepers. They maintained detailed logs of their operations, sacred sites, and esoteric teachings. Some of these were supposedly handed over to the Church upon their arrest. If those documents made it into the archive as a few cryptic mentions suggest, then the Vatican may possess not just records about the Templars, but records by them. One tantalizing clue comes from a 1493 inventory list of relics sent to Rome by the Archbishop of Tarragona. Among the items is a sealed scroll labeled Testamentum Ultimum de Molay. If this document is real, it could be the final confession or declaration of Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Templars. De Molay was burned alive in 1314, and according to legend, he cursed both the king and the pope from the flames. What if that wasn't just folklore? What if his final words were transcribed and hidden? It is here that the official story begins to break. Because if the Vatican possesses evidence that the Templars were innocent, or at least victims of political maneuvering, then it has suppressed the truth for over 7 centuries. That suppression isn't passive, it is active. It has shaped public memory, historical scholarship, and modern myth. Scholars still debate the extent of the Templars' rituals and beliefs. Some argue they were simply a military order with administrative acumen. Others believe they carried esoteric knowledge, perhaps even relics back from the Holy Land. If the archive holds their internal records, their coded prayers, their correspondences from Jerusalem, then we're not just talking about legal vindication. We're talking about an alternate history of Christianity, one where the Church wasn't the sole inheritor of divine authority. And that brings us to the most unsettling idea of all, that the Vatican didn't destroy the Templars. It absorbed them. You pass another shelf, this one unmarked but dusted, as if last touched a lifetime ago. Somewhere in this corridor, perhaps lies the true record of what happened on that bitter Friday in 1307. And perhaps, too, the story of what happened next, to the men who vanished, to the ships that were never found, and to the secrets they may have handed over before the flames were lit. The archive grows quieter here, not because it is empty, but because the names inside these folders still cast long shadows. When most think of the Vatican during the Second World War, they imagine neutrality, a walled city draped in silence, untouched by tanks, guarded only by the Swiss Guard and divine diplomacy. But as you walk further down this corridor through records still not fully disclosed to the public, you begin to feel the presence of something far more complex. A system of intelligence, diplomacy, and secret maneuvering that rivaled that of any wartime state. Because the Vatican, though small in size, was not neutral. It was watching, and in some cases, it was participating. The historical fact is, this Pope Pius XV maintained diplomatic relations throughout the war with the Allies, with Axis powers, and with various underground resistance movements. The Holy See received thousands of reports through its global network of nuncios, priests, and informants. And unlike newspapers or state briefings, these were often first-hand eyewitness accounts from occupied cities, death camps, and front lines. Many of these reports were filed directly into the Vatican's internal archives. A few were leaked. Most were never seen again. Only recently have portions of this era been opened thanks to Pope Francis's 2019 authorization to release select documents from Pius XIV's pontificate. Historians rushed in expecting answers. What they found was a fractured trail. Some files were complete. Others were curiously redacted. A few were simply missing. And buried among the predictable diplomatic letters were stranger artifacts, coded messages, anonymous testimonies, and heavily marked dossiers with labels like Sub Rosa Germania or Intelligence Judaicum, Confid. These are not standard papal correspondences. These are intelligence files. One of the most debated cases involves a letter sent to the Vatican in October 1942 by a German Jesuit reporting mass executions of Jews in Poland. The letter's author begged the Church to act. Internal memos show the letter was read and debated at the highest levels. But no public statement was made. Later that same month, the Pope delivered a Christmas address in which he spoke generally of hundreds of thousands who, without fault on their part, sometimes only by reason of their nationality or race, have been consigned to death. No names, no places, and no condemnation. Some argue that this ambiguity was tactical, that the Pope feared reprisal and sought to protect Catholics living under Nazi rule. Others see it as moral failure. But here's the quiet, overlooked part: the Vatican wasn't just receiving reports. It was generating them. A declassified Allied intelligence memo from 1944 mentions unusually accurate assessments from Vatican sources, particularly regarding troop movements and logistical staging in southern Europe. The memo doesn't explain how the Vatican obtained this information. It merely notes that their intelligence was deemed more reliable than several of our own operatives. There are references to Vatican courier routes being used to pass messages to anti-Nazi resistance cells, especially in Austria and Slovakia. Priests with diplomatic immunity were able to travel freely. Some carried sacraments. Others, it seems, carried names, maps, and instructions. A few were caught. Their fates are unclear. Their files, if they exist, are sealed. Even more controversial are the alleged connections to German officers. In one archive logbook dated 1943, there's mention of a document titled Dialogue mit Standartenführer S. The identity behind S remains uncertain, but many suspect it refers to Standartenführer Walter Rauff, the SS officer who helped develop mobile gas vans and who, after the war, escaped to South America. According to some reports, he did so with the help of the so-called Vatican Ratline's covert escape routes, used to smuggle former Nazis to safety. The Vatican has long denied formal involvement in these ratlines, attributing them instead to rogue priests or sympathetic operatives. But archival references suggest coordination that would have required institutional knowledge. One document allegedly signed by a mid-level Vatican official lists names under the heading Personae Protectae, protected persons. Several of those names match known war criminals. This leads to one of the most painful open questions still debated today. Did the Vatican knowingly aid fugitives from justice after the war, and if so, were those actions justified as a hedge against communism, a lesser evil in the eyes of the Church? Or were they simply an extension of old alliances that had never fully been broken? Not all the files are sinister. Some are testimonies from clergy who risked their lives to shelter Jews, sabotage German shipments, or hide banned books. One Italian priest smuggled over 150 people across the Swiss border, using funeral processions as cover. His name was never canonized, but his notes found decades later in a sealed envelope marked Solomon Periculum tell the story of quiet resistance wrapped in liturgy and incense. Still, the deeper mystery lingers. For every noble story of courage, there seems to be a corresponding absence, a page torn, a folder missing a name redacted in thick ink. The Church often claims it cannot reveal certain documents for reasons of privacy or diplomacy. And perhaps that's true. But it's hard not to wonder if some silences are not about protection, but preservation, not of people, but of the institution itself. A striking callback here leads us to the Chinon parchment and the Templars. Once again, we find absolutions, hidden trials reframed, and inconvenient truths buried for centuries. The Vatican does not erase history. It stores it. And when it releases fragments, it does so on its own terms at its own tempo, always just enough to suggest transparency, never enough to surrender control. One last file, catalogued but unreleased, bears a title that chills in its bluntness: De Silentio Papae. On the silence of the Pope. No author, no summary, just a title and a classification mark that translates roughly as "do not circulate without papal authority." So here in the heart of the most secret library in the world, the question echoes again. Not just what the Vatican knew, but what it chose not to say, and whether silence wrapped in cassocks and gold can ever be innocent. It's easy to forget that the Vatican, for all its robes and rituals, is also an institution with files. Not just theological treatises or diplomatic memos, but casework, human records, names, dates, symptoms, outcomes, and in the dimmer corners of the archive behind doors that aren't merely locked, but spiritually warded. Some believe there are files that defy both medicine and metaphysics. These are not stories. These are reports. Filed, notarized, signed in ink, and allegedly, in some cases, blood. The historical truth is this: the Catholic Church has always investigated miracles. Healings, visions, incorruptible corpses, each claim before being canonized must pass through a gauntlet of examination. Priests consult doctors. Doctors consult theologians. And when the Church cannot explain something, it often does what bureaucracies do best: it documents it and hides it under a title like Subcommissioner Divina Causa. If a cure defies all medical explanation and meets stringent criteria, it may be declared a miracle. But what happens to the cases that are stranger, the ones too unsettling to approve, yet too real to dismiss? Whispers among archivists speak of an internal category, causae non classificati, unclassified cases. These are not the tidy miracle stories you hear in homilies or read in sainthood profiles. These are the ones that went sideways, where the afflicted did not rise from bed, but began speaking in dead languages, where the vision of Mary was accompanied by the smell of sulfur, where stigmata appeared, but on people who never believed. One document, reportedly from the 1930s, tells of a woman in southern Italy who claimed to be healed of terminal cancer after visiting a shrine. Her tumor vanished. X-rays confirmed it. She credited not the Virgin Mary, but the one beneath the floor. The phrase is chilling. When questioned by church investigators, she repeated it. He waits beneath the floor, and he's older than the saints. The case was closed without canonization. The medical files were placed under restricted access. Then there are the exorcism records. The Church does not take demonic possession lightly. It has protocols, approval chains, and designated clergy known as exorcists, yes, the real kind, not just movie fodder. Before an exorcism is permitted, the Church requires psychological evaluation, behavioral logs, and witness statements. And when the rite is performed, the results, successful or otherwise, are recorded. Not all of those records are destroyed. Some end up here. In 1949, a young boy in the United States was reportedly possessed, a case that later inspired The Exorcist. The Vatican confirmed that an exorcism was authorized, but recently unearthed correspondence suggests something else: a private memo from a cardinal in Rome, noting that the boy's speech patterns match those observed in the Dresden case. What Dresden case, there's no official record, but the implication is clear: this was not the first time the Church had seen this phenomenon. A few scholars, the ones still granted limited access, have hinted at the existence of an internal registry cases where exorcisms were attempted but failed. Not because the demon was too strong, but because the person being exorcised claimed to not want release. One chilling line from a summary sheet reads, "Subject refuses Latin prayer. Requests continued occupation. Claims knowledge of papal sins." Whether this is a case of mental illness or something else is up for debate. But the Church treated it seriously enough to classify the file. And it's not just possession. Miraculous recoveries, bilocation, prophetic dreams, all are subject to scrutiny. But the most unsettling records may be the ones that involve convergence, where medical anomalies are accompanied by visions, where dream states result in physical scars, where a patient receives communion and then speaks of architectural details in the Vatican, despite never leaving their village. One record allegedly sealed by Pope Pius XIII involves a Spanish soldier who, during the chaos of the Civil War, reportedly vanished during Mass and was found days later in Rome disoriented, starved, and clutching a rosary that bore the personal insignia of a 14th-century pope. The soldier's testimony was dismissed, but the rosary remains unaccounted for in public records. A margin note on the folder simply reads, "Return to contingent files." 7R. Even odder are reports where saints appear not in visions, but in places they should not be. One file marked 1964, Lombardia references a nursing home patient who spoke with St. Catherine of Siena in the hallway during a blackout. The attending nurse also saw the woman, but described her as soaked in light and smelling of ink. When asked to elaborate, she said, "It wasn't like a dream. It was like the hallway breathed." The church sent investigators. No public conclusion was released. And all of this leads to the inevitable question, are these files evidence of divine activity, or of something the church fears too much to name? Because while miracles are good for public devotion, certain mysteries are not. And the archive in its silent curation seems to recognize the difference. If a saint weeps and the oil is tested, it becomes pilgrimage material. But if a girl in Krakow dreams of Vatican hallways and then draws them precisely, including rooms never published in any guidebook, that file gets shelved. Quietly, firmly, permanently. There's a soft callback here to the index of forbidden books, not in literature, but in experience. Some truths, it seems, are not meant to be read. They are meant to be filed and forgotten. The final known example comes from a case logged under Anomalies, 1957. It describes a child in Argentina who, during a local exorcism attempt, reportedly began reciting the Acta Apostolicae Sedis, the Vatican's own internal journal of papal decrees, in perfect Latin. He was 8 years old. When they asked him who taught him, he simply said, "The one with no face." The file was sealed. The priest who submitted it was reassigned. And the record marked non aperiendum, not to be opened. But you just did. You walked past the seals into the chamber of unspoken phenomena, where faith meets fear and belief is no longer the safest answer. And perhaps now you understand why some miracles stay hidden, not because they didn't happen, but because they did. At first glance, the folders look like any others, aged vellum-numbered tabs, faint Latin scrawls curling across their spines. But the color is different. Black, not ivory. A dye not used in standard Vatican cataloging. You've stumbled into the Jesuit files, or at least the ones they left behind. To most of the world, the Society of Jesus is an academic and missionary order, famed for its universities, its discipline, and its loyalty to the papacy. But hidden inside the archive, there are records that suggest something else entirely: secret missions, disputed theologies, and internal operations so sensitive they were never meant to be seen outside a very particular circle. Welcome to the Black Files. The Jesuits were founded in 1540 by Ignatius of Loyola, a soldier turned mystic who dreamed of an army loyal only to Christ, or more precisely, to Christ's vicar in Rome. The order was radical in its early days, not just in its vow of obedience, but in its zeal for infiltration. Jesuits operated as confessors to kings, astronomers in forbidden lands, and advisors in courts that still burned heretics. Their writings, correspondences, and doctrinal debates were vast, and not all of them survived public scrutiny. One of the most obscure documents tied to early Jesuit missions is titled De conversione infidelium sub silentio, roughly on the conversion of non-believers through silence. It's not listed in any official Jesuit publications, but several Vatican catalog entries hint at its existence. According to an early 17th century summary note, it outlined psychological techniques for persuasion, not through debate, but through emotional saturation, ritual exposure, and selective sensory deprivation. It reads less like theology and more like spiritual conditioning. Then there's the enigmatic Project Miriam. A folder bearing that title appears in a restricted shelf log from 1732. It's marked with both the Jesuit seal and a rare Vatican classification obscuratus per mandatum. Translation obscured by mandate. No contents are listed, but one footnote suggests it dealt with hypothetical matrilineal transmission of messianic potential. A theological mouthful, yes, but one that strangely echoes themes from the Gospel of Mary and the so-called bloodline debates we've encountered earlier. Why would the Jesuits study such a thing, and why bury it? The Jesuits' relationship with the Church has never been smooth. In 1773, Pope Clement XIV officially suppressed the order under pressure from European monarchies. Jesuit properties were seized. Their schools were closed. But curiously, the Vatican did not destroy their archives. It absorbed them, consolidated, indexed, and locked them away. Some believe this is when the Black Files were first created, not by the Jesuits, but about them. A dossier of everything too controversial to allow back into circulation once the order was reinstated in 1814. One of the most persistent rumors concerns the Ratio Demonica, the so-called demonic catalog. No copy has ever been seen, but multiple catalog cross-references list a codex by that name in the archive's sub-classification on supernatural investigation. The Jesuits were trained not just in rhetoric and mathematics, but in demonology, not to worship, of course, but to recognize and root out. The ratio is said to contain a systemized taxonomy of manifestations, along with recommended rites for encounter interrogation and banishment. If true, it would represent one of the most structured occult documents in church history, written not by heretics, but by the Church's elite scholars. There are more mundane but equally damning documents. Reports of failed missions not just in Asia or the Americas, but within Catholic strongholds. One file from 1822 recounts a Jesuit school in Venice, where students reported visions of a burning wheel and entered trances during Mass. The file includes an urgent recommendation for reassignment of all staff and the quiet suspension of liturgical services until purity of intent could be reestablished. The school was closed a month later. The incident was never spoken of again. A recurring name surfaces throughout these records: Father Girolamo Tedesco. Little is known about him except that he authored multiple essays listed as Index Internus Internal Index. His writings include strange titles on the variable nature of the soul, the geometry of revelation, and most provocatively, Christ and the circle on recurring messiahs. No copies are available outside the archive, but a short Vatican memo dated 1851 laments that Father Tedesco's writings, while intellectually robust, raise concerns of doctrinal destabilization if misread. That's a long way of saying too smart, to burn, too dangerous to publish. Even more troubling are the black files tied to internal experiments. One entry from 1926 references a Jesuit project involving controlled sensory exposure to liturgical frequencies. The term is never defined, but it appears alongside references to monasteries reporting unusual dream phenomena among initiates. Some have speculated this was a study on the neurological effects of Gregorian chant. Others believe it was a deeper attempt to trigger visions, synthetic mysticism orchestrated from within. The question arises, of course, were these simply fringe experiments, rogue priests with too much imagination? Or were they sanctioned and shelved because they worked? What makes the black files so difficult to assess is that many of their entries are partial, redacted, uncross-referenced. Some contain only titles with no corresponding physical folder. Others are so misfiled, they may as well not exist. But this absence is its own presence. It suggests a curatorial hand not simply preserving knowledge but managing it, classifying the divine, editing the miraculous. It calls back perhaps too clearly to the miracle and exorcism files, to the possession cases that veered into prophecy, to the boy who quoted papal decrees he couldn't have known. It's tempting to draw a line between them, and perhaps the black files are that line. A thread running beneath the archive connecting faith to control, devotion to experimentation. And so as you close the final drawer and step away from the aisle that doesn't appear on public maps, you feel a different kind of reverence. Not fear exactly, but caution. The Jesuits were not just thinkers, they were architects of belief. And somewhere in this archive, beneath ink and ash, they may have written a new blueprint for the sacred one that even the Church was afraid to follow. The corridor shifts again. You've passed from parchment theology and ritual oddities into something colder, stranger, a vault not of beliefs, but of bodies, genealogies, birth certificates, secret baptisms, royal intermarriages scrawled in a monk's hand. This isn't a hall of doctrine. It's a ledger of flesh and lineage, and its contents have long fueled speculation that the Vatican does not simply guard souls, it tracks blood. The existence of genealogical records within the Vatican archives is no secret. Every baptized Catholic generates a paper trail, sacramental certificates, family lineage, clerical entries. For royalty, that trail becomes a road. Kings and queens, dukes and dauphins, their marriages and heirs meticulously documented. But what begins as spiritual record-keeping becomes something else entirely when you reach the private volumes labeled Archivum Sanguinis, the Blood Archive. Few are allowed even to see the index. Those who have speak of documents so ancient, they predate papal Rome, bound in crimson leather, written in ink that smells faintly of myrrh. The historical fact is this: from at least the 8th century popes maintained genealogical charts of Europe's monarchies. Some say it was to ensure canon law compliance, no marriages between close kin, no disputed successions. Others believe it was for leverage. After all, if you hold the keys to legitimacy, you hold the crown not in your hand, but in your filing cabinet. But rumors persist that the archive goes far beyond dynasties, that buried deep within these registries are lines that stretch back not just centuries, but to the apostolic age, and perhaps even further. A peculiar set of entries is often whispered about the so-called Desposini files. These are said to record families descended from the siblings of Jesus James the Just, and others named in apocryphal texts. The Desposini were acknowledged in some early Christian writings, later dismissed as heretical than simply forgotten. Yet in a papal bull from 1481, Pope Sixtus IV briefly mentions the kin of the Nazarene in the East, whose descendants are known to us. The phrase caused barely a ripple at the time, but in hindsight, it suggests that the Vatican maintained knowledge of at least one living bloodline tied to Christ's family. Fast forward to the 19th century. An anonymous French cleric named A.G. allegedly submitted a report to the Vatican, claiming to have traced the Merovingian kings of France, long believed extinct, to a surviving rural line in the Languedoc region. The report, never published, was assigned to classis hereditas privata, a subcategory of records too politically explosive for general review. The Merovingians, of course, are entangled in myth, long-haired monarchs, sacred ancestry, even whispers of divine blood. Most dismiss these claims. But if even a partial genealogical line exists, and the Vatican verified it, what reason would it have to keep that quiet? Then there is the matter of the Codex Salomonis, not a book of spells, but an internal Vatican reference file first listed in 1757. Its contents are unknown. But the associated margin note is fascinating, of kings born from priests and priests born from queens. A poetic turn of phrase or a description of sacred convergence, some believe it refers to mixed lines, royal and ecclesiastical blood, merging creating heirs who could claim both crown and cross. In the medieval world, such a figure would have been unstoppable or unallowable. One of the few scholars to touch this material was a German Jesuit named Father Emil Conrad. In the 1920s, he published a private essay titled Lignum Cruoris, the Tree of Blood. It argued controversially that certain bloodlines had been tracked by the Church for millennia, not for control, but protection. He cited ancient rites of anointing linked to family descent, not just spiritual calling. Within months of publication, Conrad was recalled to Rome. The essay disappeared. When later asked about it, he replied only, "The archive has absorbed it." A curious callback emerges here to the letters between popes and kings, some of which hinted at disputed paternity, illegitimate heirs, and dynasties built on secret legitimations. What if those letters were informed by these registries? What if the archive didn't just store history, but shaped it by validating or invalidating bloodlines? Even the saints are not spared. A few files suggest that canonized individuals were tracked not only for virtue but for ancestry. One particularly enigmatic entry catalogued under Sanctus Genetrix mentions a woman of Galilean descent, kin to the fisherman, whose line remains within the fold. The fisherman, of course, is Peter, Galilean descent. That points again to early Christian families' bloodlines that somehow survived fragmentation, diaspora, and persecution. And if any of it is true, then the archive may contain a living, unbroken thread connecting modern believers to the original apostles, a thread carefully protected, never paraded. Then there are the darker speculations that the Church has quietly removed individuals deemed dangerously legitimate, that bloodlines suggesting messianic claims or descent from rival apostolic lines have been discredited not by argument, but by quiet disappearance. No official proof of this exists, but entries marked silentiari, the keepers of silence, appear adjacent to several questionable family dossiers. Coincidence, or foot soldiers of a doctrine that must never be tested? One final fragment found in a mislabeled 17th century binder describes a baptism performed in absolute secrecy. The infant's name is redacted, but the record includes these words, "The child bears both marks. Protect until the time appointed." What marks, what appointment? There is no follow-up file, just a single chilling line in red ink, nomen obscurum, tempus tessendum. The name is hidden, the time is silent. And so you stand now in a place where faith meets flesh, where genealogy becomes theology, and salvation might just run in the veins. Perhaps it's all a relic of clerical thoroughness, or perhaps the Church has always known that power isn't just proclaimed, it's inherited. The hallway shifts again, this time into the kind of silence you find in museums, sterile, rehearsed, yet still uneasy. You're standing before a vault that bears the polished insignia of the Holy Office of the Inquisition. That name has been softened over the centuries, rebranded, restructured, but in the time of Galileo Galilei, it carried weight like a blade. And behind this door, neatly indexed, are the records of the trial that famously pitted science against Scripture. Or so the story goes. The historical record is familiar. In 1633, Galileo was tried by the Roman Inquisition for advocating heliocentrism, the view that the Earth orbits the Sun. He was forced to recant, placed under house arrest, and his work, Dialogue, concerning the two chief world systems, was banned. The Church's stance was clear: the Earth did not move, and for centuries this event has served as a symbol of religious resistance to scientific truth. But what if that's not the whole story? What if the narrative we've inherited, dramatic, symbolic, and tidy, was carefully redacted? The Vatican has released portions of Galileo's trial documents, his initial testimonies, his abjuration, the inquisitor's statements. But archivists who've peeked deeper report inconsistencies, missing annotations, unexplained gaps, and a pattern of red ink redactions, some made centuries after the trial itself. One strange document bears Galileo's signature, but no content. A blank folio dated between two known interrogations, preserved with care. Its purpose unclear. But a margin note, possibly added in the 18th century, reads, "Suppresso per causa di silenzio teologico." Suppressed for reasons of theological silence. Then there are the letters, not the ones Galileo wrote, but the ones written to him. A few survive publicly. Most do not. A 1632 letter from Cardinal Bellarmine, one of Galileo's earlier interlocutors, refers cryptically to the unpublishable diagrams in Galileo's possession. Diagrams of what? Astronomical models, mathematical proofs, or something more esoteric. One theory posits that Galileo was not condemned solely for his heliocentrism, but for how he claimed to arrive at it, possibly through texts preserved in the Vatican's own archive. A controversial hypothesis, not mainstream but persistent, suggests that Galileo had access to ancient manuscripts from Alexandria smuggled to Rome during the early Crusades. These documents, now believed lost, allegedly included pre-Copernican heliocentric theories. If Galileo referenced them, it would explain the Inquisition's peculiar anger. Not merely that he was wrong, but that he was trespassing on knowledge the Church had buried for a reason. One callback becomes relevant here: the Index of Forbidden Books. Galileo's Dialogue was placed on the index, but only after it was published with approval from censors. How did that happen? Why would the Vatican allow a book that directly challenged its cosmology to go to print, only to condemn it months later? Some suspect internal sabotage. Others suggest the manuscript Galileo submitted was not the manuscript that was printed. Indeed, some scholars believe the published version included edits Galileo never made or never intended to be public. One particular passage in which a character named Simplicio, meant to represent a church viewpoint, is ridiculed may have been deliberately emphasized to provoke backlash. A conspiracy, maybe, but it aligns with a strange note found in the archive, written by an unknown scribe. The dialogue is printed. The offense is visible. Let him speak, and then we close the gate. Chilling words, especially if the gate wasn't metaphorical. More perplexing is Galileo's own behavior. Despite his humiliation, he remained loyal to the Church. He attended Mass. He corresponded respectfully with clerics. Even as he wrote his later works in secret, he avoided attacking the Vatican directly. Was this prudence or the result of some unspoken agreement? In 1992, 359 years after the trial, Pope John Paul II formally acknowledged that Galileo had been wronged. But the apology, though historic, was strangely vague. It blamed the theologians of the time rather than the institution itself. And more importantly, it made no mention of the missing documents, as if the facts had already been edited into harmlessness. A peculiar footnote emerges in a 1711 Jesuit inventory, listing a file titled Siderius Supplementum, a supplement to Galileo's Starry Messenger. No such document has ever surfaced publicly. If it exists, it could contain Galileo's uncensored thoughts, calculations, or correspondence, but its access code is tagged with the Vatican's highest restriction class, Archivum non apertum, not to be opened. The open question persists: was Galileo silenced for defying Scripture or for pointing too closely toward something the Church had hidden away, a deeper cosmology? A history of science not rooted in European triumph, but in forgotten civilizations and suppressed texts. After all, the stars have always been a threat to theology. They refuse to sit still. They move. They imply age distance and time scales that dwarf the Genesis narrative. And here, beneath Rome, is where that implication was captured, questioned, and locked away. A callback arises again to the Jesuit Black Files and their obsession with forbidden knowledge. One name appears in both catalog systems: Father Vincenzo Ruggieri, a Vatican astronomer assigned to review Galileo's work. He disappears from the record after 1634. But in a side note scrawled in the corner of a different folder, dated decades later, someone writes, Ruggieri's orbits still circulate, but not in the heavens. A poetic metaphor, or a hint. What remains certain is this: Galileo's trial was not merely about planets. It was about power. Who gets to speak? Who decides what can be known? And who rewrites the story when the stars refuse to obey? The hallway narrows here, not physically, but psychologically. The air feels older, denser, and while there are no signs posted, no brass plaques or official warnings, something in your body knows to hesitate. These are not files about the past. They are about the end. Not of the archive, not even of the Church, but of the world itself. They call them the Apocalypse Papers, unofficially, of course. The Vatican has never confirmed such a collection exists, but too many references, too many redacted margins and catalog stubs point to a body of documents concerning prophecy, eschatology, and the potential timeline of humanity's final chapter. The Church has always taught that no one knows the hour, but the archive, it seems, has spent centuries entertaining the possibility that someone might. The historical fact is that Catholicism has long wrestled with prophecy, from the Book of Revelation to private Marian apparitions. Some prophecies are declared worthy of belief. Others are quietly discouraged. A few are actively suppressed. And the most volatile among them, the ones received by cardinals, hidden saints, or seers, whose visions couldn't be squared with official doctrine, those, it appears, were stored. One document often cited by fringe historians but never seen is called Visiones Vaticanae. It allegedly compiles apocalyptic revelations received by high-ranking church figures between the 10th and 20th centuries. The file is believed to contain descriptions of celestial events, global catastrophes, and even specific names of nations' popes, and what are ominously referred to as the twin deceivers. That phrase alone has appeared in 3 separate catalog footnotes across centuries, but never in any publicly released theological writing. A more grounded example is the Third Secret of Fatima. When the Vatican finally revealed its contents in 2000 after decades of speculation, it described a vision of a bishop in white falling amidst corpses and a ruined city. The Church interpreted this as a prophecy of the 1981 assassination attempt on Pope John Paul II. But many scholars and faithful alike were unconvinced. Sister Lucia, the Fatima visionary, had hinted that the third secret contained something terrible and difficult to accept. Yet the released vision, though disturbing, felt oddly symbolic. Was that all there was, or was something held back? One callback emerges here to the suppressed Marian visions mentioned earlier, particularly the sealed envelopes and coded transcripts surrounding 20th century apparitions in Akita Garabandal and Medjugorje. Some of those phenomena have been disavowed, others simply placed in theological limbo. But in a 1972 memo stored in a box labeled Privata Revelatio, non circulare, a cardinal describes a convergence of warning among seers indicating a purification through fire with Rome as its epicenter. The note is unsigned. Its source remains unknown. The Church, of course, distinguishes between public revelation closed with the death of the last apostle and private revelations which may continue. But internally, some records suggest this division has not always been so clear. There's mention in a Jesuit diary dated 1897 of a concilio intimum, a private council convened to interpret a sequence of dreams shared by 5 clerics across 3 continents, all of whom saw similar imagery: collapsing spires, blood-red moons, and a figure cloaked in shadow holding the keys of Peter. The dreams were filed, the priests were reassigned, and the entry concludes simply, "No pattern shall be declared, lest belief solidify." Another fragment, chilling in its simplicity, is a note from the early 1800s that reads, "The comet returns in 2254. The book of Daniel shall be reopened." No earlier, no author, no context. Just a single sheet of handmade paper with that sentence stored in a folder marked Calendarium Anonymum. And then there's Ordo ab Termino, a rumored internal document, its name, a parody of the famous Ordo ab Chao, or Order from Chaos. If it exists, it's said to compile prophecies that forecast not just physical destruction, but institutional unraveling predictions of schism, betrayal within the Vatican, and a final pope who opens the doors not to heaven, but to forgetting. Some believe it refers to an anti-pope. Others think it's allegorical. A few fear it's already happening. Tied to this is the Malachi list, a real document attributed to a 12th century Irish bishop, which predicted a sequence of 112 popes, ending with Peter the Roman, who would preside over the destruction of Rome. The Vatican has never officially endorsed the prophecy. But curious details surface. The list was preserved in Vatican hands for centuries before being published. And in a 1958 archivist's letter found in a personal notebook, a cryptic line appears: "If the list is not authentic, it is nonetheless obeyed." Another prophecy often whispered in theological circles is that of the 3 days of darkness, a purgative global event in which the sun vanishes, evil roams freely, and only candles blessed by priests will provide light. Originating from mystics in the 19th century, the prophecy was never officially sanctioned. Yet documents exist archived under Lux et Umbrum that suggest multiple popes reviewed the prophecy, commissioned research into solar anomalies, and ordered the mass blessing of wax in anticipation. Coincidence, perhaps. But it's the kind of coincidence the archive specializes in. What makes these records so unsettling is not their content alone, but the frequency with which they've been revised, hidden, or reframed. Pages appear in 17th century inventories, then vanish in the 18th. Visions described by saints are later edited with certain phrases struck out or marked non licet recitare, not permitted to be read aloud. And always there is the same pattern: prophecy received, evaluated, silenced. A final unnerving document appears only by cross-reference. It is known simply as Manus Ultima, the final hand. A 20th century note suggests it is a sealed manuscript unread even by the reigning pope. Its opening is reserved for a specific signal which is never explained. The location is unknown. The catalog code is broken. But the implication is clear: there is a final warning. The archive holds it, and for now it waits. You close the folder, not because you're finished, but because you've seen enough. The Apocalypse Papers don't predict the end of the world. They reveal the Church's quiet belief that the end might already be unfolding, not with trumpets and fire, but with ink keys and whispers behind locked doors. There's a gap in the light here. Not in the archive's construction, the marble and stone continue uninterrupted, but in time itself. A blank space, a silence where noise should be. Walk far enough through these vaults, and you'll begin to notice it too. Entire shelves labeled with dates that shimmer with precision: 1273, 1492, 1870, followed by stretches where the dates vanish or worse, become vague. One tag reads simply, Post-Nicaea, pre-Carolingian. That's not a filing label, that's a black hole. The Church calls it continuity. Unbroken apostolic succession, preserved doctrine, guarded tradition. But historians have long pointed out the same troubling detail. There are centuries in early medieval history where our records thin dramatically, especially between the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 and the rise of Charlemagne in the 9th century. This era, sometimes called the Dark Ages, is usually blamed on social collapse. Libraries burned, literacy declined, time just got foggy. But here in the Vatican archive, that fog feels strangely intentional. The historical fact is that the Church was the single most literate institution in Western Europe during those centuries. Monks copied texts, bishops recorded decisions, popes issued decrees. If anyone had the capacity to preserve history, it was Rome. And yet some papal reigns in this era lack records. Others are disputed. And a few, like Pope Joan, the rumored female pontiff, have been retroactively erased with surgical precision. Even the Liber Pontificalis, the official papal chronicle, contains gaps and contradictions that Vatican editors have quietly sidestepped for centuries. One theory whispered by some scholars is that this isn't just a matter of lost records, but of adjusted ones. That somewhere within the secret archive lies the true accounting of a historical restructuring, missing councils, suppressed decrees, perhaps even entire popes, whose theologies diverged too sharply from later orthodoxy. A particularly troubling gap centers on the so-called phantom time hypothesis, a fringe but fascinating theory that claims nearly 300 years of early medieval history were inserted into the calendar by imperial decree. The theory points to discrepancies in dating systems, the sudden appearance of Charlemagne as an idealized monarch, and the lack of contemporary evidence for certain events. Mainstream historians scoff, but curiously, several Vatican timekeeping records from the 16th century logs kept by papal astronomers reference non-linear corrections to Easter tables predating the Gregorian Reform. One marginal note, barely legible, reads, "Gap reconciled with ecclesial silence. No wider publication permitted." Then there's the matter of suppressed councils. In 1934, a Jesuit historian named Father Andreas Wendt claimed to have discovered references to a 7th century synod held in Ravenna, wherein bishops debated the divinity of the Holy Spirit in terms that contradicted the Nicene Creed. No official records of such a synod exist, but a page in Wendt's notes, copied from a now missing manuscript, mentions a decree struck from the book for the sake of the flame. Whether literal or metaphorical, the phrase points to erasure, not loss. Another callback emerges to the Desposini and the bloodline registries. During these missing centuries, several Eastern Christian sects still claimed descent from Jesus' family, maintaining alternative theologies and calendars. Records of these groups were often absorbed into the Roman fold, rewritten or extinguished. But if the archive holds their documents, and some title fragments suggest that it does, then it also holds an alternate version of how the Church evolved. One that's not linear, not smooth, one with ruptures. The most disturbing part is not the absence of records, but the deliberate stitching of continuity over the void. In 1871, during the First Vatican Council, a report was circulated internally that examined inconsistencies in apostolic succession timelines. The report was not made public, but an internal memo responding to it included the phrase, "Continuity is not a chain of iron, but of gold leaf. It bends to protect." This bending shows up in small ways. A baptismal record from 742 is written in a hand and ink style that appears 4 centuries out of date. A papal bull allegedly issued in 798 cites a canon that wasn't written until 850. These anomalies are usually brushed aside, scribal error, misdating, copyist confusion. But in the archive where dates are gospel and ink is power, such slippages feel less accidental. One particularly enigmatic file is labeled Liber Temporis Obscuri, the Book of the Obscure Time. It appears only in a 19th century catalog, and no one has confirmed its contents. The description reads, "Compilation of temporal disputes, calendrical realignments, and ecclesiastical omissions pertaining to years 612-92. The entry is struck through in red ink. No modern cross-reference exists. And there's the altar stone. In the subcrypta, a rarely mentioned lower chamber of the archive, stands a stone slab bearing the inscription Ex su et pontifices, XXXX quiescentes, 98 popes listed, 30 resting. But the math doesn't match any known timeline. Some believe it refers to pontiffs erased from public succession, exiled, disgraced, or theologically inconvenient. Perhaps the most unsettling echo comes from a letter written in 1933 by an archivist named Monsignor Lucio Fenari. In a private note, he confessed, "I have seen with my own eyes a genealogy that does not begin with Peter, but with one called James the Keeper. It is not heresy. It is older than heresy." I was told not to ask again. Older than heresy. That phrase has clung to the archive like incense on vestments. It implies not error, but replacement. That something true was overwritten, not because it was false, but because it could no longer be allowed to exist. And so you find yourself in the heart of the Church's most delicate illusion, the illusion of perfect continuity. The idea that history flowed unbroken from Christ to council to creed. But these vaults know better. They remember the silences. They file them under dates that never were. And in doing so, they remind us that what we call history may only be the version the survivors agreed to preserve. You descend now, not just in stone steps or candlelit corridors, but through the buried layers of faith itself into the strata where the names begin to blur and the boundaries between heretic and saint grow thin. The Vatican Archive does not simply house the triumphant history of the Church. It also shelters the evidence of those it erased, their writings, their trials, their deaths, martyrs who bled in silence, and sects that believed too differently, too boldly, too early. This is not the story of Christianity as it was preserved. This is the story of Christianity as it was pruned. The historical fact is clear: the early centuries of the Church were not a clean, linear evolution. They were wild. Dozens of competing theologies jostled for dominance: Gnostics, Montanists, Marcionites, Ebionites, and others. Some emphasized ecstatic prophecy, others rigorous asceticism, others secret wisdom. And while modern scholarship accepts that many of these groups left behind fragments, the archive contains more than fragments. It holds the full reports. One document, long hidden, catalogued only as Relatio de Cahiers de Lugdunensis, details a mass execution of dissenting Christians in Roman Gaul around the year 177 AD. Officially, the martyrs were recorded as proto-Catholic saints. But the document, in a variant Latin inconsistent with later transcriptions, includes passages describing their refusal to recognize the Bishop of Rome, their alternate Eucharistic rite, and their veneration of a female prophet named Marcia. Her name is nowhere in public canon, but her followers, according to the account, sang as they were flayed, proclaiming the breath speaks not only through Peter. The implication is troubling. They may not have died for orthodoxy. They may have died for something the Church couldn't allow to live. These records are stored under subcategories that rarely see light: heresis, descripta ecclesiam, anomalae, and the most elusive sancti non agniti, the unacknowledged saints. This last grouping contains dozens of names, many with partial files, brief descriptions, arrest records, confessions. But no feast days, no hagiographies, no golden icons, just testimony sealed. A recurring figure in these files is Theodora of Antioch, described as a healer and dream reader who gathered a large following in the late 3rd century. Church historians describe her as a local curiosity. The archives version tells another story of a woman who reportedly restored sight with her hands and spoke of visions where the spirit rises from within, not above. She was condemned for blasphemy, not because her miracles were false, but because they occurred outside the liturgical framework. Her followers claimed she received a vision of Christ, instructing her to ignore the stones and speak to the living. She was executed quietly. Her sect vanished. But one folder, just one, remains in the archive marked only Antioch, unrecorded flame. One callback ignites here the forbidden books. Many of these groups preserved writings that never made it into canon. The Gospel of the Egyptians, the Acts of Paul and Thecla, the Book of El-Kasai, all exist in fragments publicly, but the archive, according to a few inventory notations, may hold more complete versions, especially a volume labeled Thesaurus Ebioniticus, the treasure of the Ebionites. The Ebionites were Jewish Christians who believed Jesus was fully human, born of natural parents and anointed by God at baptism. If such a text survives, it directly contradicts the doctrine of the Incarnation. Its existence would not be debated. It would be hidden. One peculiar file labeled Notitia de Galileo Martyrologio refers to a registry of those sanctified without papal consent. A blue martyrdom, it's called death in obscurity without veneration. In this folder, one phrase stands out in gold ink: they died in Christ, but not for Rome. The problem is not just theological, it's structural. The Church claims apostolic continuity, but if certain sects preserved practices or beliefs that predated official doctrine, that continuity is threatened. Consider the Carpocratians, who taught that the soul must experience all conditions of life before returning to God, or the Montanists, whose prophetesses spoke in ecstatic tongues and believed the Holy Spirit continued to offer new revelation. Both were suppressed. But fragments of their records, according to certain archive inventories, remain. One Montanist scroll reportedly ends with the line, "Truth renews itself when memory decays." Even stranger is the story of Felix of Numidia, a bishop excommunicated for refusing to surrender scriptures during the Diocletian persecution. Officially, his legacy was expunged after a theological dispute. But a letter from a 5th-century African priest to Rome begs reconsideration, saying Felix held the line when others burned. He weeps now in our dreams. That letter is catalogued, but it's stored with the anomalous martyrdoms, not the accepted saints. Why? Perhaps because these aren't just disagreements. They're competing blueprints for Christianity. In one, hierarchy is central. In the other, spirit flows freely. In one, the Church is gatekeeper. In the other, it's optional. A more modern echo appears in a suppressed transcript from 1912, where a Vatican theologian reviewing recovered Coptic scrolls allegedly wrote, These teachings burn not because they lie, but because they name what we dare not. The scrolls were not released. The theologian's name was never made public, but his phrase lingers. The open question, then, is not whether these groups existed, that's indisputable, but whether their beliefs were extinguished for error or competition, and whether the archive holds not just the evidence of their persecution, but the full content of what they preached. One last folder sits apart, its tag faded but decipherable, Testamentum Lampades, the testament of the lamp. It contains no document, only a wax seal and an old ribbon. But a note beside it reads, "The flame was past. It is not ours to extinguish." Perhaps the archive doesn't hide heresy. Perhaps it guards the history of those who never needed Rome's permission to burn with faith. The stone shifts beneath your step, almost imperceptibly, but enough to mark that you are walking on foreign ground. This is still the Vatican archive, yes, but the material here is not Roman. It comes from a time when the Pope no longer ruled from the Eternal City, but from the banks of the Rhone. From a place the Church prefers to call a temporary seat, a pause, a deviation. But here in the heart of the archive, the documents tell a different story, one of division, secrecy, and a papal court that may have never fully returned home. The historical fact is that in 1309, Pope Clement V moved the papacy to Avignon in what is now southern France. For nearly 70 years, 7 popes ruled from there, all French, all under the looming influence of the French crown. Rome was left behind, the basilicas, silent, the city unstable. And while the Vatican officially frames this era as the Avignon papacy, a period of practical necessity, the documents preserved from this time, the Avignon letters, suggest something more profound, a shift in power theology and internal alignment so drastic that it may have altered the trajectory of the Church forever. Most of these letters were supposed to have been moved to Rome after the papacy returned in 1377. Many were, but not all. A hidden cache remained, or was quietly reabsorbed into the archive, their contents too delicate to release. These are not the usual bulls and proclamations. These are correspondences, confessions, and coded messages between popes, cardinals, envoys, and in several cases, heretics. One folder dated 1314 contains letters from Pope Clement V to agents in Constantinople. The letters reference ancient texts returned to the West and a revision of the Eastern Gospels in light of newer knowledge. There is no official record of these revisions. The Eastern Church makes no mention, and yet here they are tucked into a folder marked Sub Rosa Avignon, a title implying these letters were never meant to survive the century, let alone 700 years. Then there's the so-called Letter of Silence, allegedly written by Pope John XXIII in 1331, addressed to the brethren beneath the seal. The letter was partially translated by a 19th-century archivist before access was rescinded. It speaks of a voice among the stones in Rome, one that has grown quiet in our absence but not deaf. Cryptic language, perhaps metaphorical. But the rest of the letter discusses a relic unnamed that was carried from the Lateran and must not be returned until the fisherman walks again upon the bridge. No historian has been able to decode that reference, but some suspect it involves a lost object removed from Rome during the transition to Avignon, possibly something tied to apostolic authority. A callback begins to echo here, the Templar dossiers. Remember, the suppression of the Knights Templar occurred during this same period, and many historians believe Avignon's proximity to the French monarchy was no coincidence. The Church's complicity in the Templars' destruction may have been managed not from Rome, but from Avignon. A theory supported by a 1310 letter found in this wing bearing the seal of Jacques de Villa, a cardinal and relative of Clement V. The letter reads, "Our hands are clean in Avignon, though our silence drowns the cries of Paris." Even stranger is the presence of female voices in these files. Letters from visionaries, mystics, and so-called mad women addressed directly to the popes. Most were ignored. Some, like those from Catherine of Siena, were recorded and canonized. But others are more troubling. A 1352 letter from an unnamed nun in Flanders warns the Pope of a red moon and a black pope who shall sell the keys to the east. Another describes a vision of 3 popes sitting on the same throne, but only one wears a shadow. These letters were not dismissed. They were filed, by hand, and marked Vaticinare Occulta Hidden Prophecy. Among the most debated finds in the Avignon cluster is a partial map inked on lambskin showing a Vatican floor plan that does not match any known records. It includes a room labeled Camerae Trinitatis, non clodenda, the room of the Trinity not to be closed. No such chamber exists today, or if it does, no one speaks of it. But a footnote in a later letter implies that the map was a gift from the brothers of the temple given in exchange for grace. If true, the implications are enormous. A Templar-Vatican negotiation, a physical exchange, a relic or a map, traded in the shadow of Avignon. The open question is whether the archive's treatment of this period represents preservation or concealment. Was the Church protecting history from decay or shielding it from scrutiny? The narrative of a temporary relocation has been useful clean. But the Avignon letters suggest deeper entanglements with royal influence, suppressed theologies, and possibly rival claims to spiritual authority that did not vanish, but splintered. One final letter, dated 1376, arrives from Rome just before the papacy returns. It is unsigned, marked only by a seal depicting Peter inverted on the cross. The writer begs the Pope to return not only to the city, but to the fire that sanctifies. The letter ends with the line, "The woman in scarlet waits not in Babylon, but beneath the papal ring itself." It's a cryptic phrase impossible to interpret definitively. Some say it refers to the Church's complicity in power. Others believe it hints at internal corruption still unresolved. But one thing is clear, the Avignon letters are not simply relics of an administrative detour. They are the diary of an era when the Church's center of gravity shifted and never fully returned to where it began. There is a moment as you pass through yet another temperature-controlled corridor when you begin to wonder if anything is too strange for this place. But then you arrive at that door, the one with no window, no title, only a rusted keyhole framed in faded red paint. And you remember, yes, things can always get stranger. Because behind this door lies the Vatican's file on one of the most macabre episodes in papal history, the Cadaver Synod. In 897 AD, Pope Stephen VI exhumed the rotting corpse of his predecessor, Pope Formosus, dressed it in full papal regalia, propped it on a throne, and put it on trial. Yes, an actual trial. With charges, a defense counsel appointed for the dead man, and a verdict guilty. The corpse was stripped, mutilated, and dumped in the Tiber. The event is recorded in medieval chronicles, long dismissed as an aberration, a moment of medieval madness fueled by political vengeance. But the archive suggests something deeper and far more disturbing. What if the Cadaver Synod wasn't madness at all? What if it was a cover-up, or worse, a warning? The historical fact is this: Pope Formosus had powerful enemies. His alliances in the Frankish Empire, his role in consecrating bishops who challenged Roman authority, and his unclear stance during the Phocian Schism, all earned him enemies both within and beyond the Vatican. But political vengeance alone does not explain the ferocity of what followed. Especially when you consider that after Stephen VI's death, Formosus's rulings were reinstated, then overturned, then reinstated again. It's not revision, it's whiplash. Here in the archive you find the folder Synodus Horrenda Privata. Its contents are partially catalogued, partially sealed. Among the accessible documents are transcripts from the synod itself, official Latin phrases, scratched onto parchment, that still bears water damage perhaps from the river Formosus was dumped into. But beneath those are margin notes, added later in a different hand. One reads, "The accusations are theatrical. The evidence is withheld." The charges against Formosus' perjury ambition performing episcopal functions as a layman are peculiar, considering that most of them were either technicalities or widely practiced at the time. But a redacted document in the same file suggests a hidden accusation that Formosus had attempted to open the forbidden tombs. No context is given. But the line is underlined in red with a footnote that says simply, "See Vault 631. Custodia Sancta." Custodia Sancta appears repeatedly throughout archive indexes, always attached to references about relics, buried chambers, and in some cases keys. What tombs could Formosus have opened or wanted to open? One theory still controversial is that he sought access to an older vault beneath St. Peter's Basilica. Some say it contained apostolic relics. Others suggest it was a repository of early Gospels predating the canon. Either way, his intentions were considered dangerous. A callback stirs to the missing centuries of church history. Formosus lived during one of those very gaps. His actions, alliances, and apparent interest in alternative church records may have challenged a narrative the Vatican was already trying to solidify. If so, his death may not have been the end of his disruption. It may have been the start of the campaign to erase him. That campaign, ironically, backfired. The grotesque nature of the cadaver synod shocked even medieval sensibilities. Riots erupted. Pope Stephen VI was imprisoned and later strangled in his cell. But the archive shows signs that the ritual did not end there. A 10th century document titled De Fictionis Post Mortem outlines a rare excommunication rite performed on corpses believed to harbor false apostleship. The process includes a formal stripping of vestments, desecration of remains, and public denunciation. It matches almost perfectly what was done to Formosus. A footnote in the margin added centuries later asks an alarming question. Was the synod a rite of unbinding? The term unbinding appears in older Vatican rituals related to the release of sacred seals, not curses precisely, but the undoing of pacts. The implication is that Formosus had made discovered or revived something the Church wanted undone, permanently. Another document catalogued but not released is labeled Res Scriptum Posthumum Formosae. The title implies a posthumous response possibly to charges that were never made public. The index card for the file contains only one sentence: words written in the dark must not be spoken in the light. Then there's the letter. Filed years after the synod, written by an anonymous Roman cleric, it describes a dream in which the corpse of Formosus weeps blood from its eyes while seated on the throne. The dream ends with the line, "He forgives, but the keys are gone." It's tempting to dismiss this as a morbid fantasy. But the letter is stored under visiones confirmatae, confirmed visions, meaning it wasn't discarded, it was acknowledged. There's even a record of a secret mass held in the early 14th century honoring Formosus. It was never approved by Rome. The rite refers to him not as pope, but as the mouth of the deep. An odd title, almost mythic. What voice did he speak for, and what silence did his enemies hope to preserve? The open question is no longer why Formosus was tried after death. It's what he threatened to reveal while alive. Perhaps the cadaver synod wasn't justice delayed. Perhaps it was truth interrupted. There is a specific kind of hush in this chamber, the kind that only gathers where belief and fear overlap. You're now in the section reserved for private revelation. Not scripture, not doctrine, but the visions, dreams, and apparitions that ripple along the edges of Catholicism like distant thunder. Some of them are known, officially acknowledged. Most are not. Because here beneath the polished marble and frescoed ceilings lie records of visions so controversial, so disruptive, they were quietly folded into silence. And none cast a longer shadow than Fatima. The historical fact is clear. In 1917, 3 shepherd children in Fatima, Portugal, reported a series of Marian apparitions. The Virgin Mary, they said, appeared to them bearing messages for the world, including secrets about the future. 2 of the secrets were made public early on. They spoke of hell war and the eventual conversion of Russia. But the 3rd secret, that one took decades to see the light, or at least, a version of it did. In 2000, the Vatican released what it claimed was the complete 3rd secret, a symbolic vision of a bishop in white climbing a ruined city and falling beneath a hail of bullets and arrows. It was interpreted as foretelling the 1981 assassination attempt on Pope John Paul II. Many accepted this explanation. Others, including theologians, journalists, and even a former secretary to the Fatima seer, did not. They claimed something was missing, something more specific, more apocalyptic. Here in the archive, there are 2 folders labeled Fatima, cum plura testimonia. The plural is strange. Multiple testimonies. Yet officially, there was only one 3rd secret. Why the multiplicity? The first folder contains typed translations of Sister Lucia's original notes. But there's a gap, a missing page labeled absentia voluntaria, voluntarily absent, which is a polite way of saying removed. A callback becomes relevant, the Apocalypse Papers. Remember the memo about convergence of warnings. Several of those notes cross-reference Fatima not as an isolated event, but as one in a pattern. A 1962 Vatican intelligence report, yes, there is such a thing, refers to non-identical Marian instructions received in parallel geographies. That same year, similar visions were reported in Garabandal, Spain. The Church has never formally approved the apparitions, but the archive contains correspondence from cardinals urging investigation. One quote from a 1963 letter reads, "Their message mirrors Fatima's 3rd part, too precisely to ignore." The repetition itself is a signal. Then there's Akita, Japan, 1973. A wooden statue of the Virgin allegedly wept, bled, and delivered dire warnings through Sister Agnes Sasagawa. Her message, unless mankind repented, fire will fall from the sky. The living will envy the dead. The Church initially declared the events credible, then distanced itself. But here in the archive, filed under Mariae Vox Extrema, the Akita message appears side by side with earlier Fatima texts. The comparison is unmistakable. Same structure, same tone, same unspoken threat. And yet it's not just visions of doom that concern the archive. It's the veiled politics behind them. One particularly sensitive document, declassified, only partially discusses the Fatima secrecy chain. It outlines how Sister Lucia's writings were handled, who read them when, and how often. Pope John XXIII reportedly opened the sealed envelope, read it, and resealed it without action. Pope Paul VI did the same. Only John Paul II chose to act publicly, though even he may have chosen a symbolic disclosure rather than full transparency. A memo from his private secretary reads, "The full truth may cause more fear than faith. Let heaven remain suggestive." But not all secrets stayed sealed. In 1998, a Portuguese priest named Father Mario de Oliveira claimed to have seen an alternate version of the third secret. In his account, the Virgin warned of apostasy beginning at the top, a possible reference to corruption within the Vatican itself. The claim was dismissed. He was quietly transferred. But a document in the archive marked Fatima Iterata seems to contain a transcript of that very phrasing. The page is tagged non confirmata, sed verificata, not confirmed but verified. Even stranger are the audio reports. One file references a 1983 conversation between a senior Vatican official and a cloistered nun in Austria who claimed to receive Marian dreams echoing Fatima's third message. The recordings were never released, but a note in the folder reads, "Voice matches cadence of Lucia. Request suppression under Vox Clara protocol." Vox Clara is the Vatican's office for liturgical translations, but here the phrase seems to indicate something else, an internal method for silencing, not translating revelation. There are also drawings, childlike scrawls included in vision reports depicting cities, burning bishops, fleeing, and something more difficult to describe. A figure with no face holding keys in one hand and fire in the other. This motif appears not just in Fatima-related visions, but in older files from 19th century mystics in Italy, from a vision received by a novice in 1741, even from a forgotten document marked Romae Desolata, 1595. The same faceless figure, the same posture, the same implication destruction, not from outside, but within. Perhaps the most unsettling reference of all lies in a folder labeled Fatima 4. No such designation exists publicly. Only 3 secrets were ever acknowledged. But the card simply says, Quarta lucis, non ex ore Mariae sed oculis puellae. The fourth light not from Mary's mouth, but from the girl's eyes. It implies a vision not spoken, but seen. And whatever it was never written, only recorded by others. The page ends with a single sentence. It showed not fire, but forgetting. Forgetting what the archive does not say. So here you are surrounded by visions that the Church validated, until they no longer fit the story. Some predicted persecution, others purification. All shared one trait: they were controlled, framed, filed, because a revelation is only as powerful as its interpretation. And when prophecy begins to point inward, when it names the gatekeepers instead of the gates, it doesn't get released. It gets stored. There's a temptation to believe the Church has always stood in direct opposition to anything labeled occult, that its role has been to condemn sorcery, burn grimoires, and exorcise demons with holy water and Latin prayers. And yet hidden in the deeper corridors of the archive between mold-scented theology debates and wartime correspondence lie texts that suggest a different story, not of endorsement perhaps, but of fascination, collection, study. A well-documented historical fact: in the 15th century, Pope Innocent V issued the bull Summis Desiderantes Affectibus, which authorized inquisitors to pursue witchcraft as heresy. This led to the infamous Malleus Maleficarum, the hammer of witches. The Church claims to have denounced it, but a first edition copy rests not in some public library, but deep in the archive. Marginalia in red ink notes specific page numbers with the phrase Concordat cum libris Hermetis. It matches the books of Hermes. Now that wouldn't be unusual unless one recalls that Hermeticism was explicitly condemned. And yet, in a neighboring drawer, lies a partial Latin translation of the Corpus Hermeticum, not banned, but studied. Annotated by a Jesuit scholar. Its spine reads Doctrina Obscura, Interna Circulatio, internal circulation. a strange phrase echoing language used not in liturgy but in alchemy. A callback to earlier discoveries becomes useful here, the Jesuit Black Files. You remember the quiet references to forbidden debates, the theological studies not meant for mass eyes. Among those was a document titled De Motu Astrorum et Animarum, on the movement of stars and souls. It contains references to planetary correspondences, astrological harmonics, and something called Vocem Arcanam, the hidden voice. The Vatican did not destroy this work. They preserved it, filed it under nomina prohibita. But why one possibility surfaces in the notes of Athanasius Kircher, a 17th century Jesuit polymath, often dubbed the last Renaissance man. His documents are widely known. Less known is the folder in the archive labeled Kircher, Clavis Nigrae, the Black Key. Inside his private sketches of Egyptian sigils, Coptic numerology, and a mirror code, said to translate prayers backwards, not for blasphemy, but for protective inversion. A note in Kircher's hand warns, not all heresy is falsehood, some is language out of season. That note alone could have drawn censure. And yet it remains not erased, but enshrined as if the archive itself resists the impulse to forget. Elsewhere in the same chamber is a locked case marked simply Solomonis Lapis, the stone of Solomon. This is not metaphor. Inside is a sliver of obsidian mounted in silver with an inscription in Paleo-Hebrew. The accompanying document claims the relic was retrieved from an Ethiopian monastery and may have been the medium used for the original summoning of Shemhamphorash. The 72-fold name of God, a formula found in grimoires, including the Lemegeton, the Key of Solomon, and the Ars Goetia, all of which appear in coded references in this wing of the archive. And now we arrive at a stranger shelf, one without labels, only symbols, a crescent moon overlaid on a cross, a downward-pointing triangle in gold leaf. Each drawer contains handwritten treatises copied from heretical texts long since purged from public record. A manuscript titled De Alia Lux, of Another Light, written in 1470, and attributed to a cloistered nun who claimed to receive visions in the voice of Enoch. Her writings describe cities in the sky, voices not of angels or demons, but between the syllables of breath. One Vatican scholar in 1923 tried to match her visions to quantum theory. He was dismissed. His notes are stored here. The further you read, the more the pattern emerges, not of faith versus magic, but of quiet surveillance. The Church was not always burning heretical texts. Sometimes it was translating them, preserving them, tagging them with Latin warnings, and locking them away, not to protect the faithful, but perhaps to understand. This complicity is clearest in the documents related to the 16th century trial of Giordano Bruno. Publicly, he was condemned for heresy, but privately, the archive records his interrogations about memory palaces, astral projection, and something called nocturna materia, night matter. In one transcript, Bruno says, "You call it evil because it cannot be held in a chalice." But it speaks. The margin simply says, obscuritas tolerata ad tempus, darkness tolerated for a time. A quietly haunting file comes next, labeled Librum Ignis, the Book of Fire. Written in 1721 by an anonymous monk, it blends Christian mysticism with Kabbalistic diagrams. It claims that the Holy Spirit once moved through corridors of flame, not metaphorically, but literally as a presence between dimensions. One passage describes a ritual designed to hear God in the silence between bells. No record of the ritual exists outside this archive. But in a side pocket, there's a wax-sealed envelope marked Auditus Specialis, special listening. The instructions inside involve fasting chanting and the ringing of 3 different metals. The practice was banned in 1743. and yet the formula remains. One last object draws your gaze: a mirror wrapped in red cloth stored under the file Speculum Demonum, the demon mirror. Allegedly used in 1812 by a bishop in Carcassonne during an unsanctioned attempt to view the future sins of men. The ritual ended abruptly. The bishop died within the week. The mirror was shipped to Rome. A cardinal ordered it never be touched again. And now it rests here, watched only by silence. So what do you make of this quiet gallery of contradiction? The archive condemns the occult in public, but preserves it in private. It rails against sorcery, but studies the texts of magi. It claims to serve the light while archiving every whisper of the dark. Because perhaps even the Church fears a world in which it has no map for mystery. And when it finds something it cannot explain, it doesn't destroy it. It shelves it. You were probably taught that sainthood is a matter of miracles, virtue, and reverence. That the Church, moved by the voice of the people and the testimony of divine intercession, elevates its holiest figures through a process called canonization. And that somewhere in that process, a devil's advocate was appointed to question the worthiness of the candidate, not out of cruelty, but caution. But that title, Advocatus Diaboli, is more than a colorful phrase. It leads to one of the most unsettling corners of the Vatican Secret Archive, a place where the Church argues against its own saints, and in doing so reveals the shadows that cling even to the holiest light. The historical fact is this: from 1587 until 1983, the Catholic Church maintained the formal role of the promoter of the faith, the so-called devil's advocate, whose job was to raise every possible objection against a candidate for sainthood. The process was rigorous, legalistic, and frequently brutal. What few realize is that the records of these trials, every objection, counter-argument, and suppressed testimony are sealed in the archive. A folder marked Sanctitatis Dubia, Doubts of Holiness, holds transcripts, accusations, and documents the public was never meant to see. Take, for example, the case of Saint Joan of Arc. Officially canonized in 1920, her sanctity seemed self-evident: martyrdom, piety, visions of angels. But in the archive, under a classification labeled Causae Interrupti, you find the arguments once raised against her. That her visions were inconsistent, that her spiritual voices contradicted church doctrine, that she dressed as a man not out of necessity, but defiance. One anonymous comment reads, "The fire may have taken her body, but not the stain of her pride." It was ultimately dismissed, but it was recorded and kept. Another file older is labeled Clara de Montefalco. Saint Clare of Montefalco was known for claiming that she had physically housed the cross and instruments of Christ's passion within her heart. After her death, the organs were allegedly dissected and symbols discovered. The Church, intrigued yet skeptical, debated her cause for centuries. The devil's advocate wrote, "A symbol cannot bleed. A metaphor cannot be dissected." And yet others argued the findings were authentic. Her canonization moved forward, but not without these spectral objections still whispering from the pages. A particularly controversial folder bears the name Filum Negationis, the thread of denial. Inside are cases of candidates who never made it past the shadows. Men and women whose causes were silenced not by scandal, but by contradiction. One document accuses a would-be saint of self-flagellation so extreme that it bordered on madness. Another refutes the claimed miracles of a mystic nun on the grounds that the only witnesses were children and they feared her. These people are not remembered. Their sanctity lies buried under bureaucratic doubt. And yet the most disturbing files are not about failed candidates, but approved ones. Hidden within the records of Saint Pio of Pietrelcina, better known as Padre Pio, is a string of questions that seem to border on sacrilegious. A devil's advocate noted the possibility of self-inflicted stigmata, the inconsistency of prophecies and strange accounts of bilocation that did not match one another. One memorandum reads, "If this be fraud, it is divine in sophistication." Even as the Church moved to canonize him, these questions remained locked in the archive. You may recall from earlier chapters the notion of suppressed miracles catalogued but unexplained. Here the pattern returns. Because not all candidates were opposed due to theological grounds. Some were challenged because their miracles were too strange, too alien. One file describes a priest in 1842 who allegedly stopped a flood not with prayer, but with a Latin word that caused a tremor in the earth. The word is not recorded. It is replaced with a dash, a blank space. The objection reads simply, "The source of this power is unclear." The cause for sainthood was shelved indefinitely. A callback to the Vatican's uneasy relationship with the occult becomes relevant. One would-be saint reportedly healed by writing ancient sigils in water. The advocate's objection, miracle or magic. The power is not theologically sourced. Another entry describes a nun who experienced a voice that compelled her to speak in unknown languages. Xenoglossy, the file says. Not verifiable, not holy, possibly dangerous, denied. But then an even stranger contradiction emerges. A folder marked Contra Beatificationem details not only objections to sainthood, but strategic delays. A candidate's sanctity may be affirmed, yet their canonization paused for reasons of timing. One note in 1975 reads, "The climate is not conducive to this narrative." Another, too soon after the council, wait 20 years. Holiness, it seems, is subject to political weather. In a rare case, you find a file where the devil's advocate recommended canonization only for higher authorities to veto it. The reason too unsettling. Challenges the hierarchy. The subject was a mystic who claimed visions of the Virgin Mary delivering messages that contradicted papal declarations. Though her writings were never declared heretical, they were sealed. Her cause quietly dropped. Her name redacted in the archive survives only in the whispers of pilgrims. And now at the end of this trail of contested sanctity, you come to a room not listed in the standard archive index. Its door bears no name, only the Greek letters Alpha and Omega. Inside rows of unnumbered boxes hold advocatus files not yet resolved. The living saints, the pending miracles, the candidates whose causes are still debated behind locked doors. You realize this is not just a record of the past. It is a forecast of sainthood yet to come. A battleground where the holy and the human contend in quiet paperwork. The Vatican presents sainthood as certainty, but within these files lies the confession of doubt. That even the holiest glow is inspected under harsh light. That even miracles must stand trial. And that in the silent dialogue between saint and skeptic, the Church reveals not only what it believes, but what it fears. You step into a chamber colder than any before. Not because of stone or shadow, but because of silence. The kind that follows a question never answered. The kind that deepens when the world looks back and wonders what the Church knew and when. The Holocaust remains one of the darkest epochs in human history, and within the Vatican Secret Archives lies one of its most controversial mysteries. How much did the Holy See know about the genocide unfolding across Europe, and why did it remain so publicly mute while millions vanished into smoke? The official history points to Pope Pius V, who led the Church during World War II. To some, he was a cautious diplomat navigating impossible neutrality. To others, he was a complicit bystander who cloaked cowardice in theological restraint. What complicates that picture are the private letters, notes, and encrypted cables that remain even now largely inaccessible, sealed in boxes marked Pontificatus Passus and Silentium Aeternum. These files contain not public speeches or encyclicals, but quiet correspondence between the Vatican and diplomats, bishops, and intelligence agents from 1939 to 1945. One undeniable historical fact is that Pius X received regular reports from across Europe, particularly from Germany and Poland, about the treatment of Jews under Nazi control. He knew of arrests, ghettos, and deportations. What he knew of extermination camps is still debated, but the timeline is chilling. In March 1942, a German Jesuit priest wrote to the Vatican warning of mass killings. His letter reached the Secretariat of State. A reply was drafted but never sent. Its copy remains in the archive labeled Responsum Vacans, Response Unsent. The obscure detail comes in the form of annotations. In the margins of certain reports are handwritten notes from cardinals and advisors, comments like unverified, avoid scandal, and diplomatic implications, grave. One file refers to the extermination claims as rumor amplified by enemies of the Reich. Yet another more disturbing includes a quote, "Silence may protect more than speech endangers. It is unsigned." Scholars have debated for decades whether this silence was strategic, a shield to protect Catholics in occupied countries, or whether it was a moral failing cloaked in ecclesiastical decorum. Some defenders cite quiet efforts by the Church to shelter Jews through monasteries and false baptismal certificates. Others point to the glaring absence of any direct condemnation of Hitler or the final solution from the mouth of the Pope. In the archive, both views find ammunition, but neither finds closure. A callback surfaces here when you explored the Vatican's WOAP2 intelligence files. Earlier you saw references to encoded communications between the Holy See and Allied intelligence. One of those messages, dated 1943, includes the phrase, "Rome fears the gates of Treblinka may echo louder than her bells." The author is unnamed. The meaning, however, is unmistakable. Even within the walls of the Curia there was awareness, perhaps even dread. More haunting still are the letters not written to the Vatican, but from it. A series of private notes from Eugenio Pacelli, the future Pius XIII, dated during his time as nuncio to Germany in the 1920s, show early awareness of the rising nationalist movement and its anti-Semitic undertones. One letter preserved under Praemonitus the Warned describes Hitler as a man whose magnetism masks rot. And yet decades later, that same man would be met with silence from the throne of St. Peter. Then there are the diplomatic compartment files, a sub-archive, where records of correspondence with Axis-aligned nations are kept. In a memo from 1944, a Vatican official discusses whether condemning Germany might jeopardize post-war reconciliation. The line reads, "Better to heal the sheep than to challenge the wolves." Practical, perhaps. But the cost was paid in human lives, not theoretical debates. One folder, long restricted, bears the title Iudaei Dispersi, the Scattered Jews. Inside are notes from bishops across Eastern Europe, describing efforts to hide Jewish families in convents, orphanages, and rural parishes. Some entries are triumphant, others mournful. A report from Slovakia lists 42 baptized Jews taken by force despite church protection. The report ends, "We prayed, and still they came." Among the most ethically fraught documents is a letter from 1943 sent by a Polish cardinal to the Pope, begging for a public denunciation. His plea, "Holy Father," the silence is beginning to sound like agreement. No reply is recorded. But next to the letter is a note in Latin, "Non expedite," it is not expedient. What remains unclear is who wrote it. There are whispers, too, of files that once existed but were removed. A former archive assistant, later interviewed under anonymity, spoke of a box labeled Noctis Vox Voice of the Night that allegedly contained the Pope's private diary entries during the war. That box has never been located in the archive catalog. Perhaps it was reclassified, perhaps destroyed, or perhaps, like so many of history's darker truths, it was simply hidden behind the safest door, the one no one dares open. And yet hope lingers. In recent years, under pressure from historians and Jewish organizations, portions of the Pius Thuthilund archive have been scheduled for gradual release. But even this process raises questions. Why now? Why in fragments? Why not everything at once? The answer perhaps lies in the realization that some silence cannot be lifted without cracking the very pillars of perception. Because this is not just a matter of policy, it's a matter of memory, of legacy, of what the Church chooses to remember and what it buries. And in this darkest wing of the archive, beneath layers of dust and diplomacy, you glimpse the heart of a terrible paradox that the guardian of moral truth once chose silence in the hour when truth cried loudest. You walk through a corridor far newer than the others, though the scent of aging parchment still lingers in the air. Unlike the medieval secrets or Renaissance intrigues buried deeper in the archive, this chamber holds memories barely older than the color television. But the light here is no less dim. Vatican II, the Second Vatican Council, was supposed to open the Church to the modern world, to cast off layers of secrecy and tradition in favor of light and renewal. And yet buried in these files catalogued with bureaucratic coldness are gaps, missing memos, mysterious revisions, and most curiously pages that were shredded before they could ever be sealed. From 1962 to 1965, over 2,000 bishops from around the world met in St. Peter's Basilica to debate the most sweeping reforms in church history. Latin masses were set aside. Interfaith dialogue was encouraged. The laity were invited closer to the sacred. But what most believers forget, or never knew, is that these reforms came at a cost, and the debates behind them were anything but harmonious. In the archive, there are file boxes labeled Concilium Secretum Secret Council, where transcripts from closed-door meetings were preserved. At least some of them. A well-established fact, many of the most critical sessions, especially those concerning the role of the laity, the authority of bishops, and the Church's stance on salvation outside Catholicism, were never released in full. The official acta or published proceedings contain carefully edited summaries. What the archive reveals in the fragile typescript drafts, with angry red slashes and handwritten emendations, is a battle not just of doctrine, but of identity. One cardinal's margin note reads, "If this passes, we erase 1,000 years. Another modernity is not anointed. Beware the breach." The obscure detail lies in what isn't there. A series of documents prepared by a group of progressive theologians nicknamed the Rhine Group for their concentration in Northern Europe were once included in the Council's working files. But sometime in 1964, those documents were pulled, retyped, and refiled with whole paragraphs missing. An archive log from that year includes an unusual entry, Documentum Emendatum Manu Pontificia document, altered by the pontiff's own hand. Which document the reference number is missing. Either clerical error or erasure with intent. Whispers among scholars suggest there was a particularly contentious draft regarding the concept of collegiality, the idea that bishops, not just the Pope, share in supreme authority over the Church. While the final documents nod to the idea, the stronger language originally proposed, including calls for regional synods with real power, was scrubbed. A memo from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith warns that such decentralization could fracture the mystical body beyond healing. One wonders if that warning was prophecy or threat. Call back now to the devil's advocate files you explored earlier. Remember how even sainthood could be contested by voices inside the church. That same impulse is alive here. A set of counterbriefs preserved under the heading Adversus Modernitatem detail coordinated opposition to the Council's more liberal proposals. Among them is a letter suggesting the drafting of a formal theological rebuke, a kind of ecclesiastical veto should certain measures pass. The letter ends with a chilling line. If we reform what God never required, we risk inviting man to author salvation. Perhaps most startling are the blacked-out files, literal redactions stamped restricted until 2080. Some are so heavily marked that only their titles remain legible. On the limits of revelation, on the rights of conscience, on the role of women in the ecclesia. You feel the weight of modern questions tied to ancient hesitations. Why delay their release for over a century? What fear does the Church harbor not of heresy, but of her own handwriting? An open scholarly debate rages over a curious anomaly: shredded pages. In a box retrieved from the Secretariat for the Council, archivists found the remains of 8 documents that had been cut not with scissors, but a blade. Experts disagree whether this was routine disposal or intentional purging. But the timing, October 1965, mere days before the Council's final session, suggests something more deliberate. One theologian speculates the pages contained votes from a private session on celibacy reform. Another claims it was a list of proposals for female diaconate. No fragments remain large enough to confirm either. And yet one detail survives. In the corner of a damaged cover sheet, written in ink almost lost to time, is a phrase, "In silentio libertas," in silence freedom. It's unclear whether the phrase was aspirational or ironic, but here in a council meant to bring transparency, secrecy echoes louder than ever. There is an air of irony in this chamber. Vatican II was lauded as the end of opacity, the Church's great breath of fresh air. And yet here you are, tracing its most hidden fibers in dim candlelight. You wonder not for the first time whether reform can truly shine while its roots are still kept in the dark. As you rise to leave, your eye catches a parchment tucked between binders. It's not labeled, but it bears the faint watermark of the papal seal. In soft script it reads, "To open the windows is not to surrender the walls, but what escapes in the breeze that cannot be returned." You do not know who wrote it, but its truth lingers long after the light fades. You don't notice the hallway at first. It appears where a wall once was, or perhaps always had been. There's no plaque, no directional sign, only a narrow wooden door with a keyhole the shape of a shepherd's crook. Beyond it lies a part of the archive most never discuss, not because it's forbidden, but because it resists being found. In this hallway there are no scrolls or codices, no parchment or wax seals. Instead, you find dossiers, files about people, scholars, researchers, priests, names that once graced academic journals and Vatican symposiums, names that now echo mostly in whispers. These are the people who got too close. Among the most unsettling facts in modern Vatican scholarship is that access to the secret archives is never fully guaranteed, even to those with credentials, and ecclesiastical favor. A well-documented example is Professor Paolo Gaetani, an Italian archivist who was granted a 3-month research window in 1997 to study papal correspondence during the Avignon papacy. 2 weeks into his study, he was abruptly dismissed. No explanation, no incident. Just a politely worded letter stating that his access was no longer in alignment with the Holy See's research priorities. A decade later, he privately claimed to have uncovered letters that contradicted the official timeline of the return to Rome, including an unrecorded papal oath to remain in France. The documents have never surfaced. Gaetani, when pressed, simply says, they took them back. Another more tragic tale centers on Sister Mariette de Charnay, a French nun and expert in Marian theology. She was granted rare permission in 2004 to examine documents related to the third secret of Fatima. 3 days later, she was hospitalized for what was described publicly as exhaustion and spiritual crisis. Privately, her colleagues reported that she had wept uncontrollably after reading a file labeled Visio Temporis Ultimae Vision of the Final Time. She claimed it described not a literal apocalypse, but a global church fracture initiated from within. She was transferred to a cloistered order shortly afterward and has not published since. The obscure detail here lies in a memo filed not under theology or doctrine, but under security. It describes a preventive redirection protocol for researchers whose inquiries may undermine ecclesial cohesion or dogmatic unity. The protocol includes suggested interventions ranging from revoking access to offering academic appointments elsewhere. One theologian, after attempting to trace lost Templar records in the archive, suddenly accepted a position in Brazil. He later admitted off-record that the job had come with a strong recommendation from Rome and a silent understanding. There's a recurring pattern. Scholars who enter the archive with ambitious projects often emerge quiet, vague, or permanently diverted. Some speak of rooms they were told did not exist. Others claim they were accompanied by handlers who recorded every page turned. One researcher from Munich recounted being shown a document only to find it missing from the same shelf a day later. "I was told I had dreamt it," he said, "but the dream had footnotes. Call back now to the vanished pages of Vatican II. Recall how documents were shredded, access restricted, and records redacted. The same methods echo here. But instead of pages vanishing, it's people, careers, publications, even memories." One British historian was working on a monograph titled "The Other Gospel Ebionite Echoes in Rome." He had been granted archive access for his research on early Christological sects. When the book finally published, it bore a new title, Unity in Antiquity, Orthodoxy, and the Early Church. Gone were the controversial arguments. Gone were the sources. When asked why, he simply said, "I lost the thread." There is a persistent scholarly debate about whether the Vatican curates not only historical documents, but also narratives. Does the Church permit access only to that which supports its institutional memory? Are dissenting discoveries quietly suppressed by a blend of diplomacy and redirection? Most Vatican archivists deny this, of course. They point to transparency reforms and digital catalogs. But even those tools are incomplete. Whole indexes are marked only with numbers, no descriptions. Requests are granted or denied without appeal. And sometimes the denial is retroactive. Among the more troubling cases is that of Father Luis Martín Andrade, a Jesuit who gained access to early Inquisition files during a sabbatical in the 1980s. His goal was to examine the Church's internal response to heresies prior to formal condemnation. He reportedly uncovered a set of theological debates about the soul's pre-existence discussions that challenged the idea of immediate creation at conception. Soon after his research was halted, he was reassigned to administrative duties and forbidden from discussing his findings. Decades later, a single paper of his surfaced in a minor Jesuit journal quoting without attribution a phrase once noted in the trial of Origen: "He knew what he ought not, and taught what could not be known." In the hushed corners of the academic world, a phrase has emerged, the velvet exile. It describes those who come too close to certain truths and are quietly removed from relevance. Not punished, not excommunicated, just guided away. Their access revoked their reputations, softened their inquiries, folded into polite silence. And yet a few defy that pattern. A rogue scholar here, a leaked document there. Footnotes that hint at things unsaid. In a journal footnote from 2015, a dismissed researcher inserted a curious phrase, "Sub rosa mane, lux, beneath the rose, the light remains." A cryptic nod, perhaps, to what was seen and what could never be unseen. You return to the hallway. The light is dimmer now. Perhaps it was always this dim. On the wall beside the door is a brass plaque you hadn't noticed. It reads Departmentum Accessus Revocati, Department of Revoked Access. You smile. A little. Not from humor, but from recognition. Some archives don't store scrolls. They store people and the questions they were never allowed to ask. There is a kind of reverence in silence. Not the awkward hush of forgetting, but the carefully measured quiet of intentional restraint. The Vatican calls its vast underground collection the Archivum Secretum Apostolicum Vaticanum. Secret, yes, but not necessarily in the sense of conspiracy. In Latin, secretum means private, personal. Not hidden, they insist, merely protected. Yet after centuries of curating, denying, granting, and revoking access, the line between protection and suppression grows harder to distinguish. You're left with a question far older than any document shelved in those marble corridors. What is the Church so afraid we might find through every room you've walked, every sealed cabinet and half-redacted page? One theme returns again and again, not chaos, not heresy, not danger. Control. Not of history alone, but of meaning. The theory that emerges from all of this isn't one of malicious hoarding, nor of some cinematic cache of world-ending secrets. It's something subtler, more systemic. It is the theory of sacred withholding. Consider the paradox: an institution built upon the transmission of divine truth, but which has spent centuries archiving that truth in shadows. They preserve the letters of popes who made deals with fascists, yet redact the musings of visionaries. They catalog exorcisms in medical terms, track messianic bloodlines with forensic precision, and store prophecies in steel drawers, but never release the full context. They welcome scholars with credentials, then quietly reroute the ones who dig too deeply. The secrecy in this light becomes not a byproduct, but a principle. Withholding isn't failure, it's function. And this is where the truly unnerving possibility takes shape. What if the archive is not hiding something from us, but shaping something for us? What if it is less a vault of dangerous knowledge and more a map of sanctioned memory, a topography of belief curated by omission? History, after all, is never just what is written. It is what is preserved and what is permitted to be read. Recall the scholars, the silences, the shredded drafts from Vatican II, the missing letters from Avignon, the Fatima transcripts. Recall the trial of the Templars and the pages marked non licet videre, not permitted to be seen. There is no need to fabricate a grand conspiracy when all roads lead to the same locked door. Even the Church's most progressive voices have admitted quietly, obliquely, that the archive is a paradox. Pope Leo XIII called it a living witness of the centuries. Pope John Paul II, in a rare comment, described it as a memory in which faith has taken shelter. And yet memory without light begins to mold. The question isn't what's in the dark, it's why it remains there. The sacred withholding theory doesn't accuse. It doesn't assume evil intent. In fact, it presumes something far more human: fear. Not fear of scandal or loss of power, but something deeper. Fear that truth, once uncaged, cannot be shepherded. That certain knowledge would scatter the faithful rather than unify them. That the fragile consensus of doctrine, ritual, and belief might splinter under the weight of too many unapproved facts. Or worse, too many unanswerable questions. In this light, every document in the archive becomes a kind of theological landmine. Some were diffused, others buried, but all were deemed at some point too volatile to walk across. The secret is not what they contain. It's who gets to decide when or if they can be known. And now perhaps you see the shape of the real mystery. Not a single scroll or cipher, not a heretical gospel or a hidden tomb, but the mechanism itself. The slow institutional calculus by which knowledge is managed, meaning is filtered, and faith is curated across time. The archive becomes less a place and more a process, less a secret and more a choice. You arrive at the final corridor. You've seen the doors, the keys, the signs that once meant nothing, now heavy with layered meanings. And behind each sealed cabinet, each velvet rope, each blinking security panel, the same whisper hums, "Not yet." Not for you. Not for now. Not because you are unworthy, because knowing too soon might mean never believing again. You've wandered long enough through marble corridors and whispered suspicions. The dust has settled on ancient parchment, and the echo of every unanswered question still lingers like incense after Mass. But now the hush is heavier, not with curiosity, but with resignation. Not every door will open, and perhaps that was the answer all along. The Vatican Secret Archives do not speak loudly. Their silence is their fortress. Every withheld record, every censored page, every redirected scholar forms a kind of negative theology, a doctrine built not on what is revealed, but on what must remain veiled. And when you finally step back from the miles of shelving and the centuries of guarded knowledge, one thing becomes clear: it was never just about what they're hiding. It was about who decided to hide it, and why that decision remains unchallenged. Here's the paradox: the Church claims the keys to the kingdom of heaven. But on earth, it also holds the keys to history, and history, unlike faith, does not forgive silence. The longer the archive guards its secrets, the more those secrets grow in the minds of the curious. They breed speculation, obsession, myth. The truth becomes slippery. Context fades. The archive's silence becomes the perfect soil for 1,000 heresies of imagination. And yet, perhaps that's the point. Because silence is not always a lie. Sometimes it is a form of mercy, other times a weapon. And once in a while, silence is simply survival, a shield against truths that even the faithful might not bear. What lives behind those locked gates may not be scandalous or monstrous or world-shattering. It may simply be fragile, too fragmented to endure the weight of certainty, or too bright to expose all at once. So as you close the final door behind you, remember this: the archive has no voice. But its silence roars louder than any sermon. It dares you to keep searching, to wonder, to knock on doors that will never open, and in doing so, to glimpse the deeper mystery. The one not buried in documents or chained behind seals. The one that whispers some knowledge must be earned, not given, and some keys must never leave the hands that forged them. Sleep now, knowing that the archive endures. It waits, and perhaps it listens.